I think it's on. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our annual get-together to discuss social developments in Europe. I'm Slavina Spasvo, the director of the European Social Observatory. And I first of all really would like to thank you for being present despite the practical setbacks due to the social movement that you may have encountered. And at the same time, as organizers, we are fully supportive of this social movement. This year's edition of the Bilan book, as we call it in French, as it's known in French, is special. First of all, in the context of the reform of the European economic governance and the upcoming European elections, Bart van Herke, as a lead editor, Sebastiano Sabato, my colleague from the European Social Observatory, sitting just there, and myself, have invited prominent contributors to take stock of key developments in the European Union and domestic policies, obviously focusing on the period between January 2020 and June 2023. And second, as every year, the book is a successful collaboration between the Observatory and the European Trade Union Institute. And this year, the collaboration has been even more special, I would say, because meanwhile, Bart became the research director of DTI, but he's still nice to us, to be honest. So let me briefly present you with the contents of the book. And well, at the end of this legislature, our idea of the three main authors was to look into two main questions which represent the red thread of this year's edition. In the first instance, the question is whether the European Pillar of Social Rights, its action plan, and their spin-offs represent a real paradigm shift in EU social policy making. And this is more on the sunny side of the story. The second question is a bit more on the dark side, to what extent social considerations are taken into account in the green transition and in the reform of the European economic governance. And so in order to address these two main questions, the chapter covered the following topics, and you have the scoop here because the book is being printed as we speak. So, yeah, thank you, Bart, for assisting. So chapter 1 by Sotiria Theodoropoulou, who I see just there, is the opening chapter of the book, focusing on the emerging new rules for the EU's economic governance. We will come back to this chapter, which won't be presented today during the conclusions of today's event. The socio-ecological dimension of the proposed Green Deal industrial plan is discussed in chapter 2 by Tommaso Grossi and Laura Reiner, and we are delighted to listen to Tommaso, who is seated just there, later on. We will also have the pleasure to listen to Laurent Vogel, who is the author of chapter 3. And this chapter provides an analysis of the main areas of activity of the European occupational health policy. We will also have the pleasure to hear Thorsten Müller, who is seated just in front of me, who with his co-author Thorsten Schulten analyzed the birth and the scope of the newly adopted EU directive on minimum wages, which is a milestone on the journey towards a more social Europe. Then we also have a chapter on the politics of minimum income protection in the EU, which is written by Viola Scianini, Angelo Vitupanaro, and Matteo Jesula. The chapter reconstructs the political dynamics leading to the adoption of the 2023 Council recommendation on adequate minimum income. And then another important issue, which became important on the EU agenda, are the politics and the policies of the EU involvement in combating homelessness, which is analyzed in this year's edition by Timo Weisthaupt and Christian Hinrich in chapter 6. And then last but not least, as every year, we have a chronology which summarizes the key events in the EU's social, ecological, and economic affairs Um, and it's written by my colleague from the OSCE, Kurina Kuminu, who is seated just there, and Gutia Alakverdieva. And as you also saw on the program for today's event, we have invited prominent discussants and stakeholders who will provide their insights and future vision on the topics that are discussed in this year's edition. And so I will stop here and give the floor to Bart, who will present them and will give you and will guide you throughout the program. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Slavina, for bringing us straight to the heart of what you pointed out, indeed, as a special edition of this Bilan social, social policy in the EU. More than special, I think it's been a very challenging and honestly quite difficult edition for a number of reasons. First of all, of course, as you pointed out, Slavina, with regard to the editorial team, I had the pleasure of moving to the European Trade Union Institute. You just mentioned that. You became the director at the OSCE, and our co-editor, Sebastiano Sabato, was posted to a federal cabinet in Belgium to go and work on the European Green Deal in the context of the Belgian presidency. So indeed, quite a challenging adventure, and so I'm all the happier that I'm able to wave a draft copy of the book, and the very final one will come off our press in the next days. In the meanwhile, you'll find some places in this room, but also outside, a QR code. You can scan it, and then you will be provided with a free copy of the book. And as always, the French edition will come a few weeks later. We continue with that tradition. Now, a second reason why this year's edition was particularly challenging, and I will get back to that in a moment, is that several of the topics that we've been covering have proved to be moving targets. This is, of course, especially the case with the discussion and the chapter and the decision making on economic governance. And I think Sotiria will confirm that actually her chapter did not stop in June 2023 or July as we intended, but is much more recent because things have been evolving as we speak. The implementation of the Minimum Wage Directive also went much more speedily than many would have anticipated, and also for Torsten and Torsten, this has been quite a challenge, but they all did it. The same thing is true for the conclusions of the book. At some point, we just had to put down our pen, because whether we looked at due diligence, platform work, European Works Councils, things continue to move as we speak, which I guess is per se a good thing, but we'll hear more about that in a moment. So I will not say more on this now. We'll have the rest of this half-day event to go more in depth. I'm just very happy to be able to welcome Esther Lynch here today. Very welcome, Esther. You know Esther Lynch as the Secretary General of the European Trade Union Confederation, the ETUC. And I'm happy that you were able to join us this morning for a little while, I will add, because I know that you have a demonstration to attend, and Slavina has also referred to that. And I think the topic of, or the reason for that demonstration brings us immediately to the heart of the matter of why we're gathering today. I believe that the action there, the demonstration is there to denounce once again the expected austerity measures of the EU. And so I think this relates perfectly to one of the questions that we raise in this book, Esther, namely whether the social turn that we documented in this book, the social turn under especially von der Leyen European Commission, can be sustained in the context of a looming austerity reload, to use that term. So I would like to invite you, Esther, to flag some of the issues within the time that you have with us that you consider essential for EU social policy making, let's say between now and the European elections. And if you could refer to some of the issues that I've already mentioned, platform work, things are happening so fast now, European Works Council, due diligence, we would be very happy to hear about that. So thank you. And I would like to invite Tommaso, Namita, and Sebastiano to join us on the stage. Okay. Thank you very much. Maybe they want to stay. They'll join us. Except if you prefer to stay in the room so that you can actually see the slides. It's really up to you, Sebastian and Amita. Wherever you would like to you join us here now, or you join us later. So Tommaso Grossi is working at the European Policy Center, the other EPC, and worked before at the Fondazione Brodoloni. He's a policy analyst, and you authored this great chapter together with your colleague Laura Reiner on the socio-ecological dimension of the Green Deal industrial plan. We're listening to you for the next 20 minutes. Please.
Maybe time myself in the interest of time. I don't know if that helps.
Oh, when you see me acting a bit nervously, it means that your time's up. You'll notice.
Excellent. Great. Well, first of all, many thanks to you, Leyen and Sebastiano, for giving us this opportunity, which I find really, for which I'm really, really grateful. The Green Deal industrial plan was under our radar, mine and Laura's, who sadly cannot be here today. And so we really welcome the idea of writing something, trying to understand the direction of travel of Europe in this regard. And so I'll start the presentation by saying, well, providing you with a sort of timeline, telling you a bit about the return of the policy that shall not be named, as it was named, sorry, by the International Monetary Fund. Unfortunately, the name is not mine, but I find it pretty accurate, because only 10 years ago, industrial policy was considered to be a taboo, which could not be pronounced. And even today in certain debates, you'd be accused of wanting to go back to a state-planned economy if you propose an industrial strategy. And so you can see from the timeline that, and the timeline of course could go onwards and backwards. I just selected a few compelling cases. You can tell that Germany in 2019, and then together with France, issued a joint manifesto for an ambitious European industrial strategy. Then it was the time of the UK, when Boris Johnson announced a pretty big plan to initiate a green industrial revolution in Britain. You have, of course, the infamous US Inflation Reduction Act. And it was only a matter of time, I would say, before the European Commission, Europe, decided to establish its own Green Deal industrial plan for the net zero age, which I will refer to as the GDIP for short. And what is made of? First of all, part of the European Green Deal, which is, and I quote, a new growth strategy that aims to transform the EU into a fair and prosperous society. And it's made of 4 pillars. All of them are supposed to make the green transition smoother and faster, according to principles of simplified regulatory environment, more trade and resilient supply chains, through the speeding up of the access to finance for industries and sectors willing to transition, and enhancing the skills of workers. Now, I think it's important to go back a little bit in history and try to understand where this turn comes from, because industrial policy in the EU has historically unfolded against the backdrop of shifting economic ideologies. So in our paper, we try to go back in order to understand better the Green Deal Industrial Plan. And we noticed that the EU has, for quite a long time, prioritized a horizontal approach to industrial policy, meaning that member states were advised to prioritize investment in basic services, in market regulations activities, and in the promotion of research and support in general for small and medium enterprises. And this was done in opposition to a more vertical approach, which is usually an approach that, you know, as the name itself states, tries to develop specific activities, sectors, and technologies, and so on. And we find a match with this approach and the so-called Washington Consensus, which in Europe found its own, you know, way of development. It is, of course, part of what scholars call neoliberal policy making. And the idea behind this was that the state should act as a market regulator rather than as a producer. And in the paper we provide some names of scholars who try to understand the nature of state's intervention in capitalist economies. It's mostly theory, but again gives you an idea of where this push for a jump back to industrial policy comes from. Notwithstanding, of course, that it is also the outcome of, you know, what scholars call the perma-crisis or the poly-crisis. So this pervasive sense of insecurity that lingers over Europe, with China and the US and Russia threatening Europe for being overly reliant on their supply chains. So as I said, some scholars view this shift to industrial policy as a clear break with ideological principles, and others indeed see this shift from market-driven neoliberalism to state interventionism as a victory of Bidenomics over Reaganomics and Thatcherite economic thinking, or as you say, over Barrosian neoliberalism, which characterized the past 10 to 15 years in Europe. However, state support, it's something that has always existed. Think of Germany, for instance, investment in green sectors, but also the idea that Mazzucato coined, the idea of an entrepreneurial state, was never fully abandoned. So I think it's fair to say, as you argue, that there is a sort of selective dismissal of neoliberal policy making. And it's yet to be seen, however, if this is done in favor of sustainability and of a fair green transition. Now, when we comes to the actual assessment of the Green Deal Industrial Plan, we group some challenges at micro level and micro level. I will start with the macro level, and with, of course, these two dimensions influence each other. So we try to look at how the GDIP unfolds. At the macro level, you can see that some scholars argue that there is a lack of ambition and efficacy of this new industrial strategy. Or even worse, it could potentially meaning a comeback to internal devaluation, with the aim of intensifying competition within member states. If we zoom out from Europe, some other scholars, and we also agree, of course, with this idea, they argue that the efforts to decarbonize may be slowed down by prices for scarce resources going up, And this will lead, of course, to a subsidy race for raw materials, and especially between governments that wish to decarbonize. Going back to Europe, so right hand of the table, regional discohesion is something that I think it's important to monitor, because some regions, of course, in the efforts to decarbonize can adapt faster than others. Think, for instance, of the differences between Germany and Poland, two member states who are highly dependent on fossil fuels and on polluting industries. But even within regions, there may be a sort of two-speed decarbonization. Think, for instance, of the Ruhr regions in Germany, which is considered to be Germany's Poorhouse, and which has been through a sort of similar shift in the past 20 years. And this, again, it's something that should be monitored, because regional discohesion has, of course, as we will see, spillovers at micro and household level. And then we also assess the different approaches of the different general directorates of the European Commission. This, of course, concerns mostly the politics behind the Green Deal. We also had interviews with some policy officers, and this is a concern that was also shared. And last but not least, the environmental cost of extractivist approaches of countries, governments in Europe willing to decarbonize could lead to increasing pollution and environmental degradation in countries, especially in the global south, that are rich in raw materials. So this is the picture of the GDIP at macro level. And I hope it's not too little. No, this is pretty big. Okay, so I'm looking at the screen. You have, of course, spillovers at micro level and household level when it comes to the assessment of the GDIP. First of all, skill shortages and skills mismatch. This is, I think, the elephant in the room that a lot of people sometimes overlook, because there is a compelling need for skills, and there is a big uncertainty in understanding also not just how to provide these skills, through which programs, so upskilling and reskilling of existing employment and jobs, but also which skills will be needed in the future. In some of the conversations we had with private stakeholders, but also social partners, this is a challenge that should be addressed soon. And I look forward to the conversation, maybe also hearing from E2I, E2C, if trade unions are in general wrapping their head around the idea of what skills are needed. And yeah, it's very difficult to predict. What else? Yeah, when it comes to skills, of course, you have green skills provided by some funding schemes, ESF Plus, the Just Transition Fund, the RRF as well. However, I think perhaps later in the conversation with Sebastiano, he can tell how fit these programs are for providing these green skills. Because we've noticed that the environmental dimensions of these programs is usually quite underdeveloped. And next in the table, another concern that we found was a historical parallelism with what happened in Germany in the early 2000s, a phenomenon we call, the scholars call, skill bias liberalization. The idea behind this is that any transition is done on the basis of skills needed. And for instance, some scholars find that the push for market liberalization in the passage from Fordism to the knowledge economy in Germany in the early 2000s was done in favor of high-skilled workers to the detriment of low-skilled workers. And so sectors and businesses are usually in favor of prioritizing high-skilled workers, and it could also be the case for the green transition that high-skilled workers are, are going to benefit more than low-skilled workers. And this, according to some other researchers who have done a preliminary assessment of the impact of the GDIP on labor markets, could lead to a more polarized labor market with, of course, low-skilled workers paying the higher price of this transition. Now, last 2 points in the table. Job displacement, it's relatively low compared to other transitions, or for instance, the digital transition. However, let's not forget that GDIP also is about phasing out polluting jobs in polluting sectors. And this, of course, has spilled over effects in different sectors and social groups. Now, I'm saying this because the workers that are at risk of seeing their job being deleted belong to a category 25 to 49, mostly men. And women and young people are underrepresented in sectors that the GDIP wishes to phase out. But there is evidence, statistically strong evidence, that the spillover effect of phasing out jobs in these sectors, for instance, in the United Kingdom in the 80s and 90s, when mines were closed, are going to affect as well the household and female-dominated employment sectors, such as manufacturing. So it's important to consider that the GDIP will have an impact not only on workers that currently work in polluting sectors, but also in households and in other sectors of the economy as well. Last but not least, something that you mentioned, Bart, and also Esther, there is a glaring lack of reference to the European European pillars of social rights in the GDIP. And so I also look forward to the conversation with Ana Carla Pereira, because we, even though DG Employment has had a role in drafting the GDIP, we believe that it should have a stronger role in the implementation phase of the Green Deal Industrial Plan. Now, after giving you this pretty worrying picture, we advanced the idea, it's 5 minutes, that some people will pay a higher price for these transitions. The name is not new, and you may have seen it somewhere else, but essentially it's based again the concept that some scholars developed for talking about the losers of globalizations, so those being left behind during the globalization in the past 20 years. And we think that it's a pretty fitting title for those who risk being left behind by the green transition, which I think it's fair to say it's a more policy-driven than globalization, which was mostly a market-driven transformation. And this is, of course, is up to debate. But in general, we believe that inadequate handling of class dynamics can really undermine industrial policy efforts, as it was in the past. We have some scholars studying this phenomenon. And then we think it was not really a bit too much of a stretch to make a parallelism with Gilets jaunes, meaning that letting pay the price of a transition, however small in scale, for instance, in the case of Gilets jaunes, can really undermine the efforts of any government willing to decarbonize. And that's why we came up with the idea of this triangle, which with each point mutually reinforcing the other, because the political backlash of the loser of the green transition will of course challenge the implementation of any decarbonization effort through reduced public support, which in turn will feed the anger, let's say, of the losers of the green transition. Last slide, and then I'll stop. We try to advance some policy recommendations for making the GDIP smoother and stronger. And first of all, we really would like to see a stronger role of DG employment in the implementation of the GDIP, placing a stronger role for the European pillars of social rights with its own benchmark systems, high social protection standards, because I think it's really important to not to underestimate the price that some workers will pay for being left out without employment. We also would like to highlight the importance of having stronger social conditionalities for industries and SMEs receiving financial support. I think it's important to have stronger social conditionalities linked to this fund, advancing training programs for workers. And then we also suggest to have, together with other organizations, of course, this is not just us suggesting this, but also an impact assessment for both the Net Zero Industry Act and the Critical Raw Materials Act, which are the two appendix of the Green Deal Industrial Plan. Because at the moment, there is no internal evaluation nor assessment of these two elements of the GDIP. And I think it's important to understand, going back to my point about the Global South, if and how extraction of raw materials which are needed for the transition to decarbonization, if they can harm countries in the Global South. And then last but not least, something that I think is shared, and that's why I quote E3G, something that is also shared by other organizations and think tanks to reduce the financial disparities between member states. I made the example of Germany and Poland, one of course having bigger financial capacity than the others, but also this example can be applied to other member states. I think it's important to address the different imbalances in fiscal capacity between member states to really give the opportunity to each member state to decarbonize at the same speed. And the idea, again, that we take from E3IG is to allocate around 1% of GDP for member state, which requires even additional assistance for decarbonize. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to invite Namita maybe to join me here, Sebastiano to join next to Tommaso. So Tommaso, thank you so much, you and your co-author for this impressive assessment of the Green Deal Industrial Plan's influence on EU labor markets, on workforce dynamics, and indeed on overall social cohesion. As far as I know, it's the first publication that goes into this topic, so I'm very happy that you did this. Also, thanks for flagging the glaring, the missing link with the European Pillar of Social Rights, which may be quite surprising. But well, maybe we'll understand during this day why this is so, but also for coming forward with some policy recommendations, because of course that's also what we do with this Bilan Social every year. We want that policymakers pick it up, use it, and I've seen it lying on the desks of some people, including in the European Commission, the European Parliament. So thanks for doing it. So without further ado, I want to give you the floor, Namita, for your feedback and comments in about 10 minutes, and then Sebastiano goes next. And Namita is working at E3G, and you're, I think, a research manager there. Thank you, Namita, please.
Thanks, Bart. Is this better? Maybe I just.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Still morning. My name is Namita, and I work at E3G, which Tommaso also referenced in his presentation. E3G is essentially a global climate change think tank with a mission to advance a climate-safe world for all. My role at E3G is to look at the social dimension of the Green Deal. But by that, I mean, I look at how fairness, equity, justice, and climate action intersect. And I very much work at the social climate and democracy nexus, which is why I'm going to frame my intervention here today through this lens, which is that of equity, justice, and fairness, but especially for frontline communities. Because we've heard a lot about workers, and there is no doubt that workers are especially crucial in this industrial transition, but we haven't talked enough about frontline communities and local communities, because while it is true, we need to recognize that while every worker is part of a community, not every community includes workers. And Esther did that brilliantly in her speech as well, where she talked about people, communities, societies, workers. And I think if we are to pay attention to the eco-social dimension, especially the social dimension, we have to talk rather about workers and communities in the same breath. So that being said, I just want to say thank you, Bart, for having me here. And thanks, Tommaso and Laura as well, if you're listening, Laura, for the paper. When I did review it, and I'd just like to quote what I said to send to Bart and Sebastiano, which was that it was, you had done an excellent job. The chapter is well written and engaging, and presents a policy assessment that is both timely and relevant. And I would encourage you all to pick it up as well, because I think that what you've done is actually taken a really complex topic and broken it down into sort of like digestible bits that are sure to speak to all of our interests here. In my own reflection, I'd like to sort of break it down or discuss my thoughts in three parts. What I learned from reading your paper, what resonated with me most deeply, and what I will take forward in my own work on a fast and fair transition. So to begin with, what I learned. What I found particularly fascinating and helpful in this paper was the brief history that you presented on a green industrial policy. Because I have to be honest, I've started working on industrial policy fairly recently, and the term itself is quite confusing because it's used quite broadly. So it was really helpful to have that sort of scene setting and background. But what I was also pleased to sort of see or read in your paper was how the policy has gone from being a policy that shall not be named. And by the way, I love that sort of label as well. It's very catchy. It helps you remember.
Again, unfortunately, not
No,
mine.
no, I know. But yes, that industrial policy has gone from being a policy that shall not be named to one actually that we're all talking about or can't stop talking about. So I think another point that I was really pleased to learn was that the EU's upscaling of industrial policy, as you put it, is seeing a shift from past ideologies, which I think is a positive, because market-driven neoliberalism has unfailingly undermined social and environmental welfare, and we can't deny that. So based on this shift, which again, I see as positive, what resonated with me, and this is based on my own work on the eco-social dimension of the Green Deal Industrial Plan, or GDIP, as we would call it henceforth, simply because that's quite a mouthful, is that while the EU does have a renewed urgency and motivation to get industrial policy right, what we still don't have is a good and coherent industrial strategy. So not just ad hoc industrial policies, but a strategy that joins up different policy areas with a vision as to how industrial decarbonization will fit in future economies. And what I mean by this is that a vision that sort of tells us where we invest, or where to invest, which incentives to use, which infrastructure to build, but also how to engage with unions, and how to bake in social protection from the start. In other words, good industrial strategy is about building certainty, but bad industrial policy will only result in some of the risks you also highlighted, Tommaso, in that it will lead to, bad industrial policy can lead to wage cuts in the name of competitiveness, and this will only result in poor outcomes both for workers and communities. And speaking of communities, I would also like to drive home the point of how narrowly the social dimension is sort of understood, defined, and referenced in GDIP. This is also where I see how the Green Deal Industrial Plan and the Inflation Reduction Act diverge. Let me start with a narrow understanding. The Green Deal Industrial Plan does include a pillar on skills. The Net Zero Industry Act within the Green Deal Industrial Plan does include a pillar on skills and training. And even what could potentially be considered as social inclusion is only seen through the lens of employment, which means that the social dimension in the Green Deal Industrial Plan essentially reduces people to the workforce. And even if we were to just stick with the skills and training bit for now, within what are called net zero academies, so to promote skills and for training, a lot of emphasis is placed on tech specific, so clean tech specific skills, but there is very little in there on lifelong learning. So one of the questions that you had, lifelong learning or foundational skills that can help workers retrain over the course of their lifetime and take on different roles that will help with broader Green Deal implementation. Also, unlike in the Inflation Reduction Act, there is very little in the Green Deal Industrial Plan that links industrial policy to improving labor standards, working conditions, or even the right to training that Esther mentioned. So there is very little on quality jobs and decent wages as well. And another point of divergence between the the GDIP and the Inflation Reduction Act is the lack of attention to environmental injustice and of the lack of attention to depolluting left behind places and of underserved communities. So I want to be very clear here. I do not think the Inflation Reduction Act is perfect, but what it does have is that it, in theory at least, or on paper, it's meant to allocate 40% of the overall sort of envelope, which is 400 billion. So that's about 40% of 400 billion to historically disadvantaged communities, to environmental justice concerns. Now, in actual practice, that's only 10%, so between 40 to 60 billion. But the fact remains that there is nothing in the Green Deal Industrial Plan that has to do with redressing harms to disadvantaged communities or even underserved communities. So for example, there is nothing that requires communities to locate clean tech projects in disadvantaged communities. Granted, there is an aspect that pays attention to environmental pollution, although it doesn't specifically label this as such. But if you look at the section on land use, there is a recognition that locating certain what are strategic clean tech projects, when locating these projects, preference should be given to brownfields sites. Now, these are essentially sites that are underutilized or abandoned because of former industrial use. But while this is good, brownfields in general should be regenerated. What the Green Deal Industrial Plan does not take into account is that most of the time it is persons of it's usually ethnic minorities, people of foreign descent, and unemployed people who live on the margins of brownfields. And that is an aspect that is not considered in the Green Deal Industrial Plan. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that in all of this, the way that the GDIP is currently set up, it will likely create false trade-offs between workers and communities, in that it will create trade-offs or tensions between jobs and health and jobs and the environment, where none should exist. Because ignoring one component of this industrial strategy to the detriment of the other will result in an incomplete strategy and one that will be unlikely to succeed. I framed this quite negatively, so I'm going to try and flip it around. My point is that industrial policy should be a driver of cohesion policy that works for both workers and communities. And because I have said the word should, but I will use that as my cue to get to my third and last point as to what I will be carrying forward and start wrapping up. So the biggest takeaway for me is that by default, industrial policy won't necessarily be fair policy or just policy or bring about just transition. And this is something that Tommaso and Laura have noted in their paper as well. And I quote here, GDIP should not only coexist with, but also advance social justice, and I would say social cohesion as well. And we have to acknowledge that while the Green Deal Industrial Plan does is a market improvement over previous industrialization strategies, in that it pays attention to sustainability, it does still need a much, much stronger social and labor framework to deliver for workers and communities. And to begin with, and here I would echo a lot of your recommendations, it does need robust social and environmental conditionalities for all sort of public funding, and with profits actually being redirected into those communities. Because what will be crucial for industrial strategy or industrial policies to do will be to create values for local communities. And it is this place-based dimension that will determine the support that these policies have on the ground. Another aspect that, again, I would echo very quickly is the need to expand on social impact assessments. And these would be done, and there is a lot of work here that we can, a lot of inspiration here that we can draw on when it comes to broader critical mining, raw material and mining projects. So there is a need to use those lessons and conduct social impact assessments with frontline communities so as to help build more trust in those projects and the very support for them. And here, I would say what is absolutely crucial will also be to involve those frontline communities and also trade unions in meaningful stakeholder engagement. And here, I mean both social dialogue, but also public participation. Because it is this kind of meaningful involvement that will, in the end, prevent the creation of false trade-offs and will prevent workers being pitted against communities, because that doesn't serve anyone's interest. Okay, so I've thrown a lot of information at you, and if you're still trying to take it all in, I have three powerful keywords: place-based, people-centered, and participatory. And for me, going forward, these are the three benchmarks that I will be using as criteria for fair and just industrial strategy. And I would very much welcome your thoughts and ideas on other benchmarks that you see for fair industrial strategy as well. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Namita, for bringing in the frontline communities, for pointing out what you learned, what resonates with you, and what you take forward, including the very narrow definition of the social dimension in the GDIP. I want to now turn to Sebastiano Sabato from the European Social Observatory, even though I think lately you've been working in a federal cabinet preparing the Belgian presidency, or did I get confused? Anyway, Sebastiano, the floor is yours for the next few minutes, please.
Still working at the European Social Observatory.
I'm glad to hear that.
Thank you, Bart. And thank you, Tommaso, for presenting this chapter, and to you and Laura for writing it in the first place. Compliments are in order, because I think I can speak on behalf also of my co-editors when I say that it was a dream chapter for book editors. The first draft we received was very, very good. The second one, the one that we will be publishing, is really excellent. Also for these reasons, I think I like a lot how to try to contextualize what's happening, the coming back of industrial policy in Europe, or maybe the arrival at the EU level, in a broad historical terms, to highlight how this can really be an historical turn for the EU. And I would say, for me, it it can be potentially the moment of truth when we talk about a just green transition, because developing the Green Deal Industrial Plan and implementing it is really at the core of the just green transition, because it requires combining a cleaner industrial basis with all the consequences that the restructuring will have, with ensuring a high level of social fairness. You analyze the Green Deal Industrial Plan communication, and we know that now it's also the moment to look at implementation and to do implementation right, because the success of that strategy will depend on many factors, such as social acceptance of the needed changes, but also political dynamics internal to the European Union, its member states, but also ensuring enough implementation means to meet the ambitions in a broader context that, as you say, it's a context of geopolitical instability. And in your chapter, you highlight actually very well how delicate might be this turn for the EU. And I agree with you in the analysis of some potential shortcomings. The first one is on, as it also been said by Namita, on the social side of the Green Deal Industrial Plan. There is a lot of emphasis on skilling and reskilling and upskilling of the workforce in an optic of labor shortage. It is indeed a key issue and goes beyond the Green Deal Industrial Plan. Is this emphasis we can find also in other important elements of the EU Just Transition Framework. It's a key issue, but cannot be the only one addressed or the only one emphasized. And here you rightly point at the fact that this should be, let's say, in a broader ensemble of social policies. For instance, we create new green jobs. We need the right skills, but we also need to make sure that the quality of those jobs is high. We will have job-to-job moves, but again, skilling will be fundamental, but in many cases it will probably not be immediate. So we still need strong safety nets, minimum income systems, and unemployment schemes. And you rightly ask to better connect the Green Deal Industrial Plan to what is a comprehensive EU social policy framework, that is the European Pillar of Social Rights. How to connect that framework to the green transition is a broader issue that goes beyond the Green Deal Industrial Plan, but I would like to listen to your opinion on some specific initiatives that might be taken, and I would also like to hear the opinion of the audience, if, for instance, in order to better align the pillar with the green transition, the forthcoming Commission assessment of the action plan of the pillar in 2025 would be a good occasion. And we should reflect on EU economic governance for sure, on the European semester, if they are good enough to implement simultaneously and at a high level of ambition green and social policies. In this respect, I'm, for instance, wondering over some recent developments, such as the introduction in the European semester of a social convergence framework. And also, I think that you have something to say, because you also wrote on that with Laura in the reformed EU economic governance, if and how this can be done, allowing for enough investment for green transition policies, social policies, and ideally more integrated eco-social policies. Then the last question for me, but also for the audience, because it goes beyond the chapter, is that, as I said, Green Deal Industrial Plan is a plan. The EU is now working on a more concrete implementation acts, such as the Net Zero Act or the Critical Raw Materials Act. If you are following those developments, do you see any changes from your analysis, let's say, of the strategic ambitions to implementation? These are only a few ideas, a few questions for you, but also for the debate. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Sebastiano. Reassured to know that you're still working at the European Social Observatory. So what's next with this plan? The link with economic governance. Not sure we have the time to discuss that now, but we'll get back to that towards the end of this half day. The pillar and green transition, and then thanks for making also the link to the broader debate about the welfare state and safety nets. We have a little bit of time for discussion, so I would like to open the floor, and then Tommaso will of course have the final word in responding to some of the issues that have been raised. Who would like to jump in? Please, if you could briefly say who you are, even though I know that you're from Antwerp.
Thank you. Henri Haapanala, University of Antwerp, indeed. I think like there's a lot of questions I have also about how the industrial policy relates to the economic governance. Maybe you can address them now, maybe you can address them later. But I think one of the key aspects here is when you mentioned the transition from Thatcher, Reagan, Barroso into Bidenomics. I think that is kind of a good example here, how the EU compared to the US is exercising its industrial policy. Why can we not call this Bretonomics or von der Leyenomics? At the end of the day, we're still talking about European industrial policy, the European social market economy. And I think these elements are very crucial for elaboration. I think one specific question, one specific point here as well is Ukraine. One specific question here is how this industrial policy, how state aid or how state interests in influencing the economy are related in the production of military material. I mean, Europe promised 1 million artillery shells for Ukraine, 300,000 have been delivered. And again, these companies that are producing artillery, they are not going to produce it unless there is a strong commitment, a political commitment by countries or by the EU to engage in production. So in that sense, I think it would be interesting to hear whether and to what extent Ukraine, for instance, is influenced in the industrial policy. Thank you.
Other questions, Lavina? And we can take a third question, sir.
Yeah. First of all, thank you very much, Tommaso, for this insightful presentation, and especially talking about the historical context and also the theoretical context. This was really very useful. I have a question to you. So you mentioned some internal divergence within the European Commission, and then you also recommended to have a stronger role for DG employment. Could you develop a bit more on these internal divergences and also on their implications for the plan? Then my second comment, it's more of a comment than a question. Namita, you talked a lot about coherence. You are pleading for a European strategy, and you rightly said that the social dimension of these policies are very much focused on the employment side. And then, Sebastiano, I really appreciated a lot that you brought in the role of traditional social protection, such as unemployment benefits and minimum income. And here I think then when thinking of future policies, we also should think of the extraordinary social protection policies, or those policies which are at the intersection between social protection and labor policies, which were the job retention schemes, which saved the European economies during the COVID crisis, and especially temporary unemployment schemes. And so I think that when in your research you are thinking of how to design a European strategy, the role of the SURE mechanism and the future of such a mechanism should be really thought through. Thank you.
Thank you. One third question, please.
Hello, my name is Ivan Ivanov. I'm political secretary for agriculture at EFAT, European Federation of Food, Agriculture and Tourism Trade Unions. And I would like, listening to the discussion, I would like to draw a parallel to to the agri-food sector. I mean, we have the farm to fork strategy, which is like the parallel to the green industrial plan, and we had there also the problem with the lack of social acceptance, and we know how the all ended with farmers protesting for several weeks in across Europe, and at the same time, we have the Belgian presidencies, and so at least for the world of work, the European Trade Union movement is also pushing for a directive on just transition, which is striving to to close this gap and to strengthen the social dimension in green policies. And I would just like to hear your opinion on that. If a directive on just transition, in your opinion, in your view, would be a appropriate tool to tackle, to close these gaps and to strengthen the social dimension of green policies. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Thomas. I think we're going to bring it back to you. So there's some suggestions, questions from the discussants, but also I think the comment about von der Leyen economics is more for the general debate, but we can see governance from Slavina, the focus on employment, and then the comment from the colleague from EFAT. So, Tommaso, you cannot possibly respond to all of this, so I'll leave you the freedom to just select the comments and questions that you would like to refer to before we're going to take a coffee break, please. Tommaso.
Thank you, Barton. Many thanks to all for the question, to Namit and Sebastiano for their reaction. I think it's I can only be really thankful also on behalf of Laura that the chapter was read and appreciated. I'll react quickly to some of the points you've raised. And well, I can only agree that, of course, the social side is missing for now. Let's not forget, this is a communication, it's a plan. So as Sebastiano said, has to go from plan to implementation. As of today, we know that the two main appendix of the industrial plan, namely the critical role, sorry, actually just the first one, Net Zero Industry Act, was approved by the Parliament and the Council less than a month ago. So the plan is on its way to be developed and implemented. So for now we wait and see, but I think I don't see any particular reason why also the next legislative cycle should change the direction of this. I think it's fair to say that it's collectively agreed on as a strategy by even those political forces that are more fiscally conservative, to put it in a way, and you would expect that we're maybe less in favor of an industrial for the reasons I've explained before. You know, these member states are now in favor of this idea of strategic autonomy, and yeah, I think we will see it happening in a while. What else? Of course, the European Pillar of Social Rights, although the Council recommendations for a fair and just transition are mentioned in the Green Deal Industrial Plan's communication, yes, the reference to the pillar is lacking for now, and hence our point, me and Laura's, of course, about the stronger role of DG employment, and to respond also to Slavina's question on the internal divergences within the European Commission. I think it's only fair to ask which directorate would have a more leading role and which else would be more in the backseat of this plan. Since it's a quite transversal plan that touches several directorates, again, I think it's fair to ask whether DG Comp will have some divergences with DG Trade, or you know, Breton versus Vestager, And this is things that we have seen also in previous policies. So yeah, it's something that we have explored in the paper with some interviews, and I cannot really say that I expect some harsh divergences between directorates, but again, because it's something that touches many of them, I think it's important to highlight this possibility. Or think, for instance, Digitrade and Klima. This is something that will have to be, once the industrial policy strategy is out there, I think these two directorates will also have a word in this. I think it's fair to expect some divergences. Last but not least, social safety nets. I quote the work of Sebastiano, so I think he's the expert here, but when it comes to economic governance, yes, that is crucial, of course, to finance strong and resilient welfare systems. And I also would like to highlight the work that the Belgian presidency is doing in promoting social investment in this respect. The La Hulp meeting has been mentioned. I was myself involved in the EESC opinion on boosting long-term social investment for the Belgian presidency. I really see an effort in that direction from political forces willing to push for stronger welfare system. And I think it's also important to highlight that if in the past welfare system and social safety nets were associated with sluggish growth and being too much of a burden for a state's economy, there is more and recent empirical evidence showing that welfare states are actually a productive factor, can be really important as enablers of the transition, can support the transitions, can help the people, households, citizens, workers, non-EU citizens living in EU, being part of the transition. So I think it's important to mention this aspect of economic governance when it comes to welfare states. And von der Leyenomics. There's also catchy label. I don't know. I mean, we try to make the link with previous ideological positions, but trying to understand if this is a genuine post-neoliberal behavior is beyond the scope of our paper, but it's certainly food for thought. I mean, at some point we will have to think of what has been done by this commission, and if we'll be, if von der Leyen will be re-elected and the implementation will be done under her second stint. I think it's something that we can reflect on, because it would be probably quite an important achievement.
Okay. Thank you very much, Tommaso. So von der Leyenomics, social convergence framework, social investment, austerity. I think we need a second conference to discuss all of these topics. Namita, I saw your two hands going up. So that means that you need 1 minute for a response, and then we go for a coffee break.
30 seconds, actually.
30 seconds, thank you.
Was just to your point, to say that I think we need to also change the way we understand competitiveness, because I think, and flip the narrative on it, because I think it's very, very important that we understand that the competitiveness of EU's sort of industrial strategy will depend on the extent to which it is aligned with our social model, which is unmatched in terms of protection and opportunity. And I think when we start with this shift, I think we will also begin to see a lot, hope, that is the hope. Maybe this will then push for more of the public investment that we need, or for more of the investment that we need in our public services, because yes, and Esther mentioned this, that part of the reason of why our competitiveness is hurting at the moment is linked to the lack of affordable housing. And I would extend that further to say that what we also need then maybe are universal basic services. So not just housing, but transport, energy, good food, and care, so that people can thrive not just as workers, but also as active members of their community and society. And that's just all that I want to say.
Okay. Thanks very much. I need a coffee at this stage. I realize that we're running behind schedule, but I think we needed that time also this morning to listen to Esther Lynch. That's why I allowed a bit of more time for that. I think we have some flexibility with regard to lunch, but coffee is needed now. It will have to be brief though, 10 minutes, and then we'll come back here. Thank you. Time to get started again. Please take your seats. Laurent Vogel is a former head of unit at the European Trade Union Institute. And he wrote a very good chapter on occupational health and safety policies in turbulent times. And actually, I think about 5 years ago, Laurent also contributed with a chapter that was also covering several years. So that was he does every few years, a state of the art of occupational health and safety policies in Europe, each time with a good and critical view. As you may know, OSH is one of the cornerstones of what we do at the E2I. So I'm very happy, Laurent, to have you on board, even though you sent through your slides yesterday at around midnight because you had to replace someone last minute in the Brussels rain to accompany Ukrainian delegation because I know that you're very much invested in that work. And so I'm all the more grateful that you could make it here today. So for the next 20 minutes, the floor is yours. And then we will listen for about 10 minutes to Vanessa de Greef, and I will introduce you in a while. So please, Laurent.
So the plan will be very simple, only 2 points. One point is the evolution of the legislation on occupational cancers, which was the major development in OSH legislation for, I would say, a long period, all the 21st century. And so it's interesting to understand what is behind that success story. So the result of let's say the change in the legislations are really good, and it was surprising in a general climate which is not so good for social priorities. And then I will also speak about the new strategic framework and to compare to a certain extent what is in that strategic framework and the hopes or the dreams which were formulated during the COVID. There was a lot of reflection about what should be the world, the post-COVID world, and a part of this reflection is about working conditions, work quality, and so on. And so it's interesting to see a brief time after the end of the pandemic, what has remained from those hopes and those dreams in the strategic document of the Commission about OSH. So why the issue of cancer is really a central issue, but fundamentally is the first cause of death among the workers due to the lack of prevention. I won't explain how and we can calculate those numbers, but every year 100,000 workers, more than 100,000 workers dying from occupational cancer. So a cancer caused by exposures in their working conditions. It's a massive factor of inequalities. Of course, you have much more building workers, nurses, people working in the agriculture exposed to pesticides than people working in other fields and with higher social position. You have frequently multiple exposures. So during your life, you are not exposed only to one carcinogen at work. In most of the cases, there will be several carcinogens with, in some cases, synergic effects. You have a lot of invisible exposure. What does it mean? It means that in most of the cases, you are exposed to a carcinogen, but you don't feel bad. So the next day, the next week, you are still in good health. You have no pain. It's no smell, no symptom of anything dangerous. And that's why the prevention of cancer must be based on a very systematic approach with a full risk assessment and so on and so on. because it's much, from that point of view, it's not like musculoskeletal disorders. When the day after or the week after, you feel some pain, and then you can realize that something bad is happening to your body. In the case of cancer, you won't feel, in most of the cases, you won't feel anything during years and years. And there is a double invisibility of women occupational cancers, and the most dramatic example of that is breast cancer. There is practically no prevention in Europe for work-related breast cancers. And only 2 countries among in all the EU have recognized some breast cancers as occupational diseases. So you can see the difference. So cancer among men are also under-recognized, but not like the breast cancer for women. And there are some transgenerational mechanisms for certain cancers. So it means that people can be exposed and their children could be affected by a cancer linked with that exposure. It's especially the case with pesticides. And you know how the discussion on pesticides now is difficult in the European Union. The most ambitious plans have been reduced. And last year, the Commission gave a new authorization for glyphosate, which is one of the most used pesticides, and following the International Agency of Research on Cancer, it's a carcinogen agent. So recently we had a good survey made by EU OSHA, so the Bilbao agency. It was published at the end of 2023. It's covering 6 countries, and it's considering just 24 factors. So it was impossible to have too many questions. So 24 factors were selected. And for those 24 factors, the result was that during the last week, so when the workers were interviewed, 47% of the workers were exposed at least to one factor. So that's really a very high number. And the prevalence of exposure was higher in small companies, which is very important because there is a problem of workers' representation. We know that in big companies, usually there will be a specific workers' representation for health and safety, and it will at least give more, let's say, force to the prevention. But in small companies, in most of the cases, you have no workers' representation for health and safety. It means that the employer himself will decide how to organize the work. A big limitation of that study, both from a scientific and political point of view, is that there is no gender data in the first document, the conclusions. And night work was not considered about the 24 factors, and night work is an important factor for some cancers. So how many cancers could be prevented with a more effective prevention? So it's about 200,000 in the EU. The precise figure is 190,000. And you can see that a lot of cancers could be prevented, but let's say the 3 most important groups are lung cancer, number 1, then breast cancer, number 2, and bladder cancer, number 3. But then you have a lot of other cancer. I won't give more detail about that. So if we consider the timeline, the need for a revision of the directive was already recognized at the beginning of the 21st century, so in 2000, 2001. At that time, the Commission organized a consultation of social partners. There were several resolutions from the European Parliament, and there was a consensus on the need to revise the directive, not necessarily on the content of the revision, but on the need to revise the directive. But then, unfortunately, there was a complete freeze about that. It's linked with what we have called by several names. Let's say the most frequent is better regulation. So the idea was that new regulation should be evaluated on a cost-benefit basis, and it created really a situation where nothing was moving. So for any proposal, there was a very long process of evaluation, and at the end, an interrogation point. We don't know exactly if the benefits are higher than the cost. And then during the year 2016, the Dutch presidency of the Council made really what was an ultimatum to the Commission to say, you must undertake the revision now. The previous position of the Commission was, we won't take any decision before the complete ex post evaluation, which was not finished at the time of the Dutch presidency. But then suddenly that pressure was highly efficient. The Commission went to a big conference in Amsterdam, and they announced there will be a revision of the carcinogen directive, and the revision will be organized with different batches. So it means that we won't make a complete revision with one proposal. There will be several proposals for the revision. And indeed, that was for us an excellent opportunity. It was an excellent opportunity for the European Parliament and for people wanting a high level of ambition, because it means that what you can't get with the first batch, you can try to get it in the second batch or in the third batch. And indeed, that was the dynamic. So from the very beginning, the Parliament proposed a lot of ambitious amendments, and then some of the amendments were immediately adopted with the batch for which they were presented, and some of those amendments were adopted in the second, the third, or the fourth batch. So that was very positive. And here you have the line of time. So you see the first 4 batches, which now are all adopted, and the process is going on. We know already the content of the 5th batch and the 6th batch also, and we have ideas at least about the following steps. And for technical reason, one important issue, which is asbestos, was treated under another directive, but the result was also highly positive. So if we try to compare, let's say, the proposals with the directive adopted, so there is absolutely no doubt the directives which were adopted are at a higher level than the proposals. So, and I take especially 3 points. The extension of the scope of application of the directive to substance toxic to reproduction. It was not accepted by the Commission. Then the Parliament voted a first amendment, which in the trilogue was, let's say, was not an amendment in the scope of application, but it was an obligation to the Commission to present a proposal at a certain date. And then when the successive batches were discussed, there was no proposal from the Commission about reprotoxic substances, and then the Parliament got the agreement of the Council to introduce those substances. And that's very important because there are also very high concern substances with basically the same problems than carcinogens. They are not visible, they have a long-term effect, and so they need, I would say, very strict measures of prevention at the workplace. Then the second point was about the diesel exhaust emissions. It's a massive problem in Europe. About 8 million of workers are exposed to those emissions. They were excluded in the proposal, but they were included in the final decision, so in the compromise between the Council and the Parliament. The same for cytostatics and hazardous drugs. So those drugs are not only, but a lot of them are used for treating patients with cancer. Of course, you need them. So in that case, it's not about substitution, it's about the working process. Or you can administrate and avoid that the health staff could get a cancer just because they are treating patients with cancer. Then an important part of the revision is about adopting occupational exposure limits, which is a tool, an important tool to make prevention. And there were some successes. So some amendments were really adopted with what I would call a good limit values, but there were also some failures. And one is about crystalline silica, well, so the limit which was adopted is much higher and doesn't protect effectively workers against cancer. And the same for hexavalent chromium. There are about 1 million of workers exposed to hexavalent chromium. And the parliament improved the level of protection, but still it's a very low level of protection. And so then those points should be, let's say, examined in the coming batches. I won't discuss about how limit values are adopted, so you can read that in the paper. And now, what is the explanation? So why suddenly we got the revision of the carcinogen directive which was fundamentally a successful revision. So the level of protection of workers against cancer is now at a much higher level than it was before the revision. Of course, now there is all the problem of implementation, control at the level of member states. But the text of the directive is really a good basis for improving the prevention against cancer. So I would say that there was a particular alignment of stars. And from one side, the European Parliament was the driving force. And in the Parliament, there was a very strong alliance. So most of the amendments were voted with 85% of the votes. And in most of the cases, the ID, ultra-right, and ECR, hard-right, were abstaining more than opposing the amendment. So it means that it gave, let's say, to the Parliament an important strength in the negotiation with the Council. And that was an important point. For even let's say, in that strong alliance, we had also people which were, let's say, relatively at the right of the political spectrum, but very sensibilized by the cancer issue. That was also something positive. Then there was a constant pressure of trade unions, even where there was absolutely no perspective. So let's say 15 years ago, when everybody was telling us, no, there will be no revision of the directive before 2040 or something like that, we were keeping the pressure. And that pressure was, from one side, let's say, the classical political pressure with the parliament, with the member states, and so on, but also it was combined with a high level of expertise. And I believe it was a good example also of cooperation between ETUC and ETUI. So because ETUI was working with several persons full-time and with a large network of national experts. And it means that when the process of revision started, we had already practically 95% of the materials we could provide immediately to the parliament. We were not obliged to study again all those issues. And that was very important. And maybe that's a lesson for the psychosocial risks. So that if the trade unions, so I hope that it will come as soon as possible, but even if it doesn't come as soon as possible, it's very important to prepare concrete proposals and in order to be serious. So because when we were making amendments, most of those amendments were based on science, but also on practice. So most of the amendments were based on the situation of at least one national state. In some cases, it was the Netherlands, other case Germany, other case France. So it was easy to say, no, it's technically possible because at least in one state, it exists. Then among member states, some of them, many of them, I would say, were concerned about the playing field for industry. So they had higher level of protection for their workers. And then they said, okay, if we have adopted new rules, and that was the case of at least 7, 8 countries, it would be good to have the same rules in the common EU legislation. And then business sectors were divided. So Business Europe was basically against any new regulation, but that was, I would say, a dogmatic position for anything. But sectoral federations, so in most of the sectoral federation, they were sensible because the impression was that if you don't have an improvement in the OSH legislation, we will pay that with REACH. So because then the criteria for authorization or restriction under REACH will become higher. And so that was a kind of, I would say, that was for them an internal discussion. What do we prefer? To have more obligation under OSH legislation, which is mainly for employers, not for producers, or do we want to have more pressure on producers through REACH? And for example, the chemical industry was in favor of most of the amendments voted by the parliament. They didn't shout it, but discreetly they said, no, that's Business Europe, but we can live with that. Then and that was very efficient. Okay. So now the new strategic framework. It was adopted by the Commission in June 21. That's not something new. So we have a long tradition of, so the name have changed. Sometimes it was a strategy, sometimes it was an action plan and so on. But from the beginning of the 70s, there were action plans for social policy. And in those action plans, there was always a chapter for OSH. And then from 78, there were specific OSH programs. Then if we consider the content of the strategy adopted in 21, one of the big question is, it was immediately after the COVID crisis, or still during, let's say, but during the declining phase of COVID. And during the COVID crisis, OSH was very poorly integrated in the national COVID strategies. So it means that the specific problems of the workplace were not considered in most of the cases. And we know that many workplaces became clusters. We know that, for instance, in the meat industry, we know that in the agriculture with seasonal workers, we know, of course, in hospitals and schools and so on and so on. So it means that working conditions have played a very important role in COVID among the working population. And then during the COVID crisis, there were a lot of discussions about the post-COVID society, and the question of working condition was one of the elements, because suddenly we saw that some sectors which were considered as, let's say, less important with lower salaries and so on, were completely necessary for the society, and other sectors maybe were not so important. So there was a new vision of the division of labor, and knowing that those fundamental sectors for the life of society are massively sectors where women are working. And then there were a lot of, let's say, ambitious proposals about how working conditions should change after the COVID. And unfortunately, let's say the most important points were not reflected in the new OSH strategy. So one very important point is workplace democracy. It's not only about health and safety, but health and safety is a very important component of that. Gender equality and the quality of work. And when Esther was speaking about ethical stress, so it's really an important question. Other researchers are using the words, the meaning of work. We see now that in a lot of sectors, there is a shortage of staff, not because people with diplomas don't exist, they exist, you have qualified people, but they don't want to go back to a sector where they feel that the meaning of their work is not respected. And that's a form also of occupational risk and violence for those people. So about the concrete content of the strategy, so the very positive point is to keep the priority on cancer, and that's certainly something positive. There are some points about workers who are not or poorly covered by existing legislation, like platform workers, so I won't enter into that discussion. And also about telework, but you know that the negotiation was not a success. But there is still a legislative freeze about two very important issues, which are musculoskeletal disorders and psychosocial risk. And also there is no revision of the biological agent directive. So that directive is working well, I would say, in normal condition, but in pandemic condition, the provisions are not adapted to that. And then I shall say, okay, now we are with an uncertain future, and there will be elections in the parliament. There is a risk, and we have already seen that about the Green Deal, about pesticides, about different issues, that EPP could move toward the most right-wing groups. Will they get the majority? So it's a possibility, but nobody knows what will happen with the coming elections. And it's clear that without the leadership of the parliament, the situation there, I wrote poor perspective. No, I'm not completely agree with that. I would say difficult perspectives. So I believe that we can find levels, other levels. Maybe litigation. Litigation was really a crucial element, for instance, in the case of asbestos, and one of our colleagues in E2I will produce in a few weeks or months, I don't know, a big report about litigation on health and safety, and maybe that could be one way, and also trade union action.
Thank you so much, Laurent, for this tour de force. 5 years of occupational health and safety action at the EU level in about 20 minutes. One of the things that I learned really from your chapter is that while the negotiations are ongoing, or while a directive is being adopted, work already continues, and that the next batch of amendments is already being prepared. So it's a kind of a rolling ball that allows to integrate changes in the labor market, societal changes in the scientific knowledge, etc. And so the detail of that is really very fascinating in your chapter. So on the carcinogens, you're more positive, I would say. The stars were aligned. We are more skeptical about this new EU strategic framework. Disappointing, high ambitions, low yields. And finally, I'm happy that you stress also in your chapter the need of technical expertise to be able to talk about occupational health and safety, which is also why at the E2I, of course, we keep this very high on our agenda. And for psychosocial risks, which you call the new, maybe the next battlefield on OSH at the EU level, will be prepared. So I want to now pass on to Vanessa. Vanessa de Greve is professor of social law at the Université Libre de Bruxelles. She's also teaching occupational health and safety law, and surprisingly at the Centre de droit public et social. So Vanessa, the floor is yours for the next 10 minutes or so, and I believe that you're also colleagues at the ULB, right? Please, Vanessa.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very honored to respond to Laurent, which is one of the most serious and demanding, in the sense, technical experts in my field. So it's always a great opportunity. I will react with three questions. I know we have to take the train. I'm used to it. So first question, I haven't checked your slides yesterday night, but it's linked to that. First question, how to create other success stories. Second question, how to have, don't be afraid, how to have better regulations for a better health. And last question, how can we protect all the workers with all our rules? The three questions are directly linked to the paper of Laurent. So the first thing, how can we create other success stories? So if Laurent explains to you the positive trend in occupational cancers, it really means that social Europe has made progress. Huh? It's very exigent, very difficult. So we can be very happy. Maybe you did something about that here. So the first thing I wanted to come back to you made a special slide about the alignment of stars. I think we really need to take the lessons about that to think about the future. How can we have the convergence of factors to make that possible for other disease? And so you explain that the work of the parliament, the work of social partners, but also the facts in the paper that the right and the center were aware of the enormous weight of the disease, so occupational cancer, on our society. So it was exactly you spoke about psychosocial risk, and I was thinking, okay, it's quite common also for employers to have that kind of problem. Okay, 1 person on 4 has mental health problems today in Europe. So can we have maybe here also an alignment of stars to have a PSR, so psychosocial risks directive? And of course, I think it will be desirable to have one common definition in Europe, to be sure that we have one assessment for psychosocial risks, especially to have maybe like in Belgium, a specialized prevention advisor in this field, to be sure that we can fight this kind of risk. So maybe you will react on that or maybe you have other ideas than psychosocial risks, and you will say, okay, I see here an alignment of stars, or maybe we can work on that to be sure that we can choose the best fights to have other stories, success stories like occupational cancers. My second point is how to have a better regulation for a better health. So you understand the criticism of Laurent about the cost-benefit model chosen, which is called better regulation. And okay, I'm not sure it will be suppressed tomorrow. So I'm maybe more realistic person sometimes about that. But can we not make progress and be stricter about the players who carry out this analysis? Laurent explained quite often that okay, the companies, people who are doing this kind of analysis and model are coming directly from the industries who need to have not too strict rules. So I mean, there is quite a conflict of interest in the model better regulation today. For me, it will be also very, very, that's for me a main point in Belgium, but also in Europe and everywhere, to have massive data collection. Massive data collection today. I think we don't hear about that. We speak about a lot about privacy, actually. And the right of privacy, and okay, I'm doing human rights quite often too, but privacy is used in a bad way sometimes today. Sometimes it's used to create to cover the company's practices. And even yesterday, I was speaking with workers from the committee, from one of committee for the prevention and protection of health, and they were explaining me, okay, I'm asking the employer, can we have the number of person who have an who are arrested in our company? Can we know the turnover here in the company? And they say, okay, the employer doesn't want because of the GDPR. So we ask question and we have GDPR. This question of, for me, there is a real clash here. It's not new between privacy and health. And that's quite problematic. I think we really have to do something here. It's unacceptable that to use workers' private lives as a means of failing to protect their health. And so there is something to do about that. And so the first thing to do for me is to have massive data collection. It was also the problem during COVID. I don't have really a long time to speak about that, but after 1 year in Belgium, for example, we know which sectors were more problematic about COVID and to protect workers' health. So 1 year lost just to know which sectors are problematic. So if we have a big data collection, we don't need to wait 1 year to do something. The last point is how can we protect all the workers? So Laurent already explained how some how some workers are forgotten. You told it here at the end of the presentation, and so I think it's really important when we think about the next directives to think about this this question. So the first question is who is going to be concerned about the directive? And I think we cannot now stay with the definition of the classical workers that we know in a market economy, globalized, where the link of subordination changed form. We need to think about that. So recently, now we are very happy in Belgium, for example, because the domestic workers are finally protected for violence and harassment. And finally, Belgium ratified the ILO Convention 190. So I think we really need to make that easier. It's not normal that we have to think about. Normally, I think the rules must be really better articulated and to think about more massive scope of workers, and it's too restricted today. So really to change, I think that. So to summarize my opinion, I do not disagree with Laurent. How can I? I think like him that we must think big, because if there is one feature that social Europe has, it is that of having evolved or occupational safety and health systems. It's really it's so great that I can say to my students, social Europe exists. Wow. I can show you with the occupational health and safety rules that we have made so many steps and so many countries were constrained to move. I mean, it's a great achievement. And also for unions, I think it's great to see that sometimes fights give some feedbacks and and make happy to see the victories that we have. So that's it. Our legacy cannot stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Un grand merci, Vanessa. Thank you so much for these points. I propose that we take a few questions also from the room, and then we bring it back to Laurent. So let's see whether from the audience there are questions. I know there are some OSH experts out there, but also people who are not. So please, this is your chance. Don't be shy to raise the question that you always wanted to ask about occupational health and safety. There's a question here.
Congratulations, Laurent and Vanessa, for your dedicated work to OSH. And when looking at this lens of occupational health and safety, I also see the link as a doctoral researcher on lifelong learning and the role for trade unions on the independent variable of the stars alignment. And the way you pronounce that, indeed, in my research, I'm doing interviews right now, I did a lot of desk research, is one of the 5 components when looking at industrial renewal or industrial relations renewal theory. We see a lot about capabilities of trade unions and strengthening negotiations and lobbying skills. And so when seeing your example, it did bear some fruits. I really hope that within trade unionists, or I wish for you all as a very unbiased researcher, that that when picking the next battles, Vanessa, I hear you say, let's try to pick up the right battles, that you pick lifelong learning or upskilling to copy this positive example on the alignment of stars and the impact of it.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes, please, sir.
Just a very brief one, because we were talking about greening in the last panel. And I would like to ask the panelists how you see the impact of climate change on occupational safety and health, and what would be the way forward, in your opinion?
Very good. And then Slavina, and then we take it back to Laurent.
Thank you very much, Laurent. And I was one of the first ones to read your chapter, and I had a great pleasure to read even a longer version of your chapter. So and thank you, Vanessa, for a great presentation as well. And I'm happy to hear that you tell UOB students, and I come from UOB, that social Europe exists. So I wanted to ask you, we see a lot of emphasis now also from the Belgian presidency on mental health. It was also mentioned by Esther Lynch this morning. And she also referred to the fact of individualization of these issues. Could you tell us how we could make this issue more collective, let's say, how to handle this issue on a more collective level? Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so Laurent, how do you create other success stories, the alignment of the stars, how to have better regulation for better health, how to protect all workers, including the ones that are now forgotten, and then the role of trade unions, greening and climate change. By the way, we're now recruiting researchers at the E2I on greening, climate change and OSH. And then finally, Slavina's question about psychosocial risks. Laurent, you can pick and choose.
Okay.
Or respond to all in 5 minutes.
Very quickly. So about the question of intervention of trade unions and industrial relations, there is a model which was discussed in Canada already maybe 20 years ago about the way trade unions can have influence in health and safety, but that can be seen also in a broader context. And it's the model of knowledge-based activism. And so there you have really I would say two important components. One thing is that when it's a complex question, you must have knowledge about it. It's not like let's say for salary, you can have a target and fix what is a minimum salary, and then if you are strong enough, you can get it or not. But it's more simple. When it's about psychosocial risk, when it's about cancer, when it's about any even environment, climate change, and so on, those are very complex issues. And so it's important to have knowledge-based activism. What does it mean? It means from one side that you need the knowledge, and you need to develop among the workers the capacity to make their own part of the research. It's very important to have, I would say, a bottom-up approach from the workers' experience to, let's say, a general knowledge of the problem. And in working conditions, usually workers are very happy to present their view of their work. It's when you are making interview with nurses, with people in the cleaning industry and so on, and you ask them to describe their work and the problems they find and so on, usually there is a high level of responses and good quality of that. And so I believe that's very important. And in the case now of psychosocial risk, so that, and I will treat at the same time the question of individualization. What is important is not the individual reaction of everybody, of any person to a certain level of risk. What is important is the risk itself. So we are not treating individually the workers. That's for other people in society, outside the company. We are treating the factors of risk, and we are trying to have the best analysis of those factors of risk, knowing that, of course, the individual reaction to those risks can differ from workers to workers, but that's not different from traditional risk. Even if you take silicosis among the miners, there were miners exposed to exactly the same level of silica with wonderful lungs after 40 years. Like people can smoke thousands and thousands of cigarettes, and for some individuals, they will keep perfect lungs. So there are different protection mechanisms among the persons. But of course, the real protection of workers against silicosis was to adopt limit values and the strictest possible limit values on silica. And that's the same for me in the case of psychosocial risk. And what is very important also, in my view, is what happened in France with the litigation on France Télécom. Because in that case, you had a huge company with tens of thousands of workers, and you had dozens of people suiciding themselves. So the litigation was not about the individual case, who was, I don't know, in trouble with the sons, or who was in trouble for economic reasons and so on. No, it was about the objective factors of risk, the way the company was managed, the target, which was to change completely, I would say, the human relation systems in that company, and so on and so on. And that litigation on suicide was really very important, and I believe it could have, maybe we'll see that in the future, the same importance than litigation on asbestos. Because in the case of France Télécom, it was clear that it was not the weakness of individual which was the problem. You can say, okay, some weak elements committed suicide. No, it was the problem of the general management system in France Télécom. And so for me, so that when you have, let's say in the case of Belgium, when you take the statistics on invalid people, so people with more than 1 year out of their work, you see you see an increasing trend, and you see that that increasing trend is depending only on two groups of diseases. So it's stable for the other diseases, but there is a big increase about diseases linked with psychosocial factors like burnout, and there is also a big increase in musculoskeletal disorders. And so that means it's not about individuals. When you have 100,000 people which lost their work due to a certain kind of disease, the factors can't be purely the individuals. About climate change, so of course there is a big impact on OSH. And please take the last issue of SMAC, because it's a special issue of climate change, so I won't develop that point. The only thing I want to insist, the problem is not only the question of ease. Of course, ease is a very important problem for the building workers, for agriculture, and so on and so on. But it's not only that. And you have a lot of, I would say, other factors, which it's really a complex picture, because climate change is affecting all the dimensions of works, not only the question of ease. So then the important point, of course, is to fight to have some criteria, legal criteria about ease. That's, let's say, the starting point. But climate change doesn't stop with that. There is also, you have many changes, for instance, about infectious diseases, how you are managing hospitals, how you are managing, so a lot of, so in the agriculture, of course, there will be big changes due to the climate change. And the measures for, let's say, mitigating climate change can also raise problems for health and safety. So it's not because something is green that this thing is safe for the workers. Unfortunately, it's not like that. Sometimes it's very green, but also very dangerous. Sometimes it's both green and not dangerous, but that's not so often. And so I believe that in the strategy of climate change, the OSH dimension should be present from the very beginning. We shouldn't wait to see negative effects and then intervene. We should integrate the awareness that any change in the world has an impact on OSH, and that impact should be considered before deciding any change. And for doing that, and really I believe that's very important, democracy at work is a fundamental element. Because if you have democracy at work, you can detect very quickly, very soon, what is the problem. If there is no democracy at work, you are waiting 20, 40, 50 years before detecting the problem. And then, of course, you are losing time. there was climate change. Yeah, just one element maybe about the arguments for psychosocial risk directive. One positive thing I see when I compare with cancer is that psychosocial risk have a cost for employers. It's not the case of cancer, because most of the cases of cancer are for people out of the company. So they're older or they've changed their workplace and so on and so on. So the cost for a company of an occupational cancer is near zero. It's paid by the society, it's paid by the families. But in the case of psychosocial risk, it's not like that. And for instance, the shortage of workers in some sectors is really a problem for their employers. So it's not nothing that after COVID, sectors like HoReCa or the hospitals and so have difficulties to find back workers. So that can be an argument which can be used to convince at least part of the employers that it's in their interest also to have better rules for psychosocial risk. And then I'm sure, and maybe I believe that Vanessa will agree with me, that litigation can really play an important role. So litigation is not only the question of justice in one particular case, X versus I. No, it's also about creating awareness in the society about a problem. That was very much the case of asbestos in the 90s, with very big cases of litigation when at EU level, so the policy on asbestos was still very conservative and not effective. I believe that psychosocial risk, or it was the same also for equality for women, where litigation played a very important role. I believe that for psychosocial risk, a litigation strategy can be useful.
Excellent. Thank you very much to both of you for these, I would say, upbeat messages. So social Europe exists. I wrote it down. I'm happy that indeed you shared it with your students. I also try to do that with mine. And they often don't believe me, but I haven't talked enough about occupational health and safety. So I'll bring that in. Secondly, the knowledge-based activism. I think this is a key notion. Again, Laurent, thanks for sharing that. I think that we continue to do that at the Institute. I want to thank you also, Laurent, for all those years that you have brought in that knowledge-based activism, and actually you still continue to do so. I also want to use the occasion to thank Marc Sapir, who is over there, who is a former director at the ETUI of the Technical Bureau, and he was also one of these people that have contributed to this knowledge-based activism, and I can reassure you that the next generation is also in line and is ready to continue doing that. And at the same time, we're not going to be naive. So also thank you, Laurent, for pointing out the big challenges ahead of the June 2024 European Parliament elections, a parliament that is so important in this OSH business, and the leadership that will come out there will be crucial. But that will be the work for a next Bilan Social, I guess. So thanks to the two of you for your magnificent contribution. I propose we swap panels now. I want to invite Torsten Müller to the floor, and then followed immediately by the discussion with Anna Carla Pera. So please, Torsten. So while the slides are being, they're already set up. So Torsten Müller is a colleague at the European Trade Union Institute. Many of you know him. He's which one is back? Senior researcher, recently wrote a very interesting policy brief on the dawn of a new era, and I think that's what we're going to be listening to. He had a PhD in Warwick and works mostly on collective bargaining and minimum wages and some other topics. I saw you nodding when Laurent was referring to democracy at work, another topic that is very important to your work. So Torsten, the floor is yours for the next 20 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. It's 20 minutes and the program is only 15. That's
well
useful information. Thank you very much.
I'll get nervous after 15 though.
If I see you wiggling around, I know it's time. Okay, thank you very much for the invitation and to present what we've done in our chapter. Now, we actually, and I've written this chapter with my dear friend and colleague Thorsten Schulten from the Economic and Social Research Institute in the Hans-Böckler Stiftung in Düsseldorf. So I used up my 5 additional minutes already for the title of the institute. So what did we do? We did actually 3 things in our chapter. First, we analyzed the different stages of the political process, the different interests, the different interaction between the actors involved at the different stages. And when Laurent talked about the alignment of stars, I felt reminded of what we did actually there, because it was also a very, I wouldn't call it alignment of stars, because stars you can in most cases not move. Actors you can move. So it was a specific constellation of actors and interests which made this possible. But I don't want to talk about that. You can read about that in the chapter. What I want to do, I want to focus on the second and the third thing we did in the chapter, and that will answer the question, why is it actually a milestone in EU social policy making? And I think the second and the third part answer that. We also analyzed the potential or the implication that are there already of the directive on minimum wage setting and collective bargaining. And the third part we tried to put it then into a broader perspective of the EU approach to wages and collective bargaining, and of course, in the context of this book, social policy making more generally. So why is it a milestone in EU policy making? Well, I think practical examples I will give you speak for themselves, but I think you won't have a directive like that without an appropriate mindset and narrative behind it. And there, I think we have to also see where we came from when this directive was adopted. And there, I think this can best be illustrated by the famous, or I should probably say infamous, report by DG ECFIN in 2012. That was in the context of the handling of the financial crisis at the time. And there you have to remember the mantra was cost competitiveness. Everything that's good for cost competitiveness should be promoted. And in the field of wages and collective bargaining, this obviously meant freezes and cuts of minimum wages, decentralization or undermining, weakening collective bargaining. And then, of course, if all that doesn't work, then the overall reduction of wage setting power of trade unions. And that was the culmination of wisdom at the time within DG ECFIN. And the great thing is that, because if we look now, 12 years later, a little bit more than 10 years later, we see a complete shift of 180 degrees in the perception of wages and collective bargaining. Because the principal objectives, obviously, of the directive, as the name already suggests, is the promotion of adequate minimum wage levels and strong collective bargaining. But behind that, there are more overarching objectives, which nobody ever talked of in the handling of the crisis, financial crisis in 2008, 9, and the successive years. So there are social goals. I mean, it's about ensuring a decent living for workers. It's about the reduction of in-work poverty and inequality. But also in terms of the economic goals, obviously competitiveness still is an issue. But there are also at the same level of priority, I would say. It's providing fair competition, and it's about ensuring a stable and inclusive economic development. And the most important thing is adequate minimum wages and strong collective bargaining are now seen as an essential part or even a prerequisite for this. And then, of course, behind all this is the even bigger goal of stabilizing the society and strengthening support for European integration, because I think that could be seen as one of the learning processes with European policymakers, that they noticed, I think we went too far, that these consequences of our austerity measures went too far. And we could see this in Greece, Portugal, Ireland, countries that have been particularly hard hit by austerity measures, but were also traditionally very pro-European. And suddenly we saw an emergence of much more Eurosceptical views in these countries. And I think that was part of the policymakers' learning curve. We have to do something that portrays and that supports the integration project with the citizens. So that's the first thing. So how to go about the promotion of adequate minimum wages and strong collective bargaining. I will not be too technical, but I mean, the directive is not about setting fixed standards. This is what the minimum wage should be. there are legal problems why the Commission or the European level cannot do this. But this directive is about setting procedures to achieve adequate minimum wages. And for that reason, certain criteria are included in the directive. I don't want to go into detail because I think the most important aspect in terms of practical implications is the second one, the criteria to guide the assessment of adequacy. Once again, the Commission or the directive cannot set standards and say these are the criteria you have to take into consideration when assessing the adequacy, but they make some strong recommendations, I would put it. And one of them are these so-called indicative reference values, which we used to call the double decency threshold of 60% of the median and 50% of the gross average wage. And as I say, they are not legally binding, so the member states are not obliged to take these as their criteria for setting adequate minimum wages, but they developed over time a certain normative power. And if we look now why these are so important, once again, I don't want to go into detail. These are actually the percentages, minimum wages expressed in the percentage of the median and average wage. And I think the most important message here is that only one country, and that was Slovenia, actually fulfilled these thresholds, which are recommended in the directive as a measure for adequacy. And only Slovenia fulfilled that in 2022. To be honest, we have a certain time lag in data. As you can see, 2022. In the last 2 years, there have been substantial minimum wage increases in a range of countries. So I think by now, Croatia should be close to that threshold as well. But those are not taken into consideration in these OECD data. Anyway, the message is clear. There is still a lot to be done to achieve adequate minimum wages in the sense recommended by the directive. But what we can also see is that even though the directive has not been transposed into national law yet, this needs to be done by November this year. It does influence minimum wage setting in different ways and to different degrees. And 4 different ways we can see. The first one and the strongest one is to actually put parts of this double decency threshold into national law and turn the soft law of the directive into hard law of national legislation. And that Bulgaria, for instance, did that. They changed their minimum wage law saying, okay, now minimum wages need to be at 50% of the average wage. One note of caution, this may still not be enough to make a living. And that's why we as trade unions always recommend we need some kind of reality test by exposing this level of 50% of the average to a certain basket of goods and services and measure, is this actually enough to afford this basket of goods and services? But that's on another, that we deal with later then. It's good that we have this quite pragmatic indicators already. The second point or the second way is some countries use these double decency threshold as a political guideline. This could be seen, I mentioned Croatia already as an example with quite substantial minimum wage increases. And these substantial minimum wage increases have been explicitly justified with reference to the double decency threshold. We see Cyprus, they've just introduced a statutory minimum wage, and the first level they set it at was 60% of the median. And then we see 2 countries, Ireland and Estonia. In Ireland, we have a government commitment to increase the minimum wage to 60% of the median by 2026. And in Estonia, we have a tripartite goodwill agreement that this should happen by 2027, but there it's 50% of the average. And the countries, I mean, the threshold is 60% of the median and 50% of the threshold. So if you fulfill 50% of the average in Estonia, you automatically also fulfill 60% of the median because they always take the one that's more favorable. Okay, the third way is, in some countries, it boosted the debate about adequacy. And I mean, one good example is Germany, because the adoption of the directive actually boosted a political debate about, hey, should we actually have the 60% of the median in our national legislation? And there is a discussion now going on. So it brings up a new debate in certain countries. Latvia and Spain would be other examples. And then, of course, this is also important as part of a union strategy. In Hungary and Romania, for instance, The trade unions refer to this double decency threshold in the tripartite discussions with governments and employers. But the best example, I think, is the Netherlands. I really like that because there they started a campaign for 60% of the median, and it's a nice rhyme. And now, Bart, you have to excuse my Dutch, but for in better bestaan, 60% van de median. And so for a better living, 60% of the median, and that's why we ask for 16 euros per hour. It's great. I think it's also very daring to have a campaign based on a concept which probably 90% of the population doesn't really know what it is. So it's great. I really like that, and I wish our Dutch colleagues all the best for that. So, but that's why the double decency threshold also plays an important role in influencing minimum wage setting or developments and discussions. Now, the same can be said how to achieve adequate collective bargaining coverage. And there, once again, there are certain provisions that aim to strengthen trade unions and so on, but there is also a quantitative indicator, and that's actually a stronger indicator than the double decency threshold, because this 80% threshold, if a country has a coverage below this threshold of 80%, it is actually required to establish an action plan with the explicit intention to increase collective bargaining coverage. That's quite strong, and governments have to do it. What we see in practice is then that governments still say, well, are there any sanctions linked to this? Well, no, I don't see any sanctions. So, well, we write anything in there. But I still think there is some kind of political pressure to actually put something in the action plan that works. And part of it is also because it needs to be reviewed and updated regularly. It needs to be made public and notified by the Commission, so the Commission can also check, hey, are these measures actually really working, what you put in there? So I think that can be quite strong. And this is also very important because if we look at collective bargaining coverage figures, we see that only 8 countries actually fulfill these figures at the moment, or at least in 2021. There's also a data issue. I don't want to go into that. The message is clear. In 19 countries, or in a substantial number of countries, action is needed to actually get to the 80%. So, and how do we do that? And once again, I have 3 examples that illustrate that this provision of the 80% actually influences concrete developments. In Romania, in December 2022, we had a change of the law on social dialogue, which was just 3 months after the directive has been adopted. So one might say this would have come anyway. But if you talk to actors involved in the political process in Romania, they say that in the final stage of the discussion of this revision of the law, the directive, or the proposal as it was at the time before it was adopted, already played an important role. And what you can see, I don't want to go through it, but what you can see is that the measures that have been introduced or changed in the law in Romania are actually all those measures that reverse the measures that contributed to the destruction of collective bargaining in Romania in the crisis management 10 years earlier. So in that respect, once again, learning curve, we have to reverse it if we want to strengthen it, what we destroyed before. And the measures aim at strengthening sectoral and cross-sectoral bargaining in particular, because I should have mentioned before, the 80% you only get if you have strong sectoral bargaining. The 80% in the directive are actually a call for sectoral bargaining, because if with company level bargaining, you will not get to 80%. And Romania did that step. And I think what's also important is that in Romania, it's not only about strengthening collective bargaining at sector, but also at company level, but also improving the conditions of union activity. It's easier to establish a union at company level in Romania now. And I think that helps as well. And this is this dual logic. First of all, the legal framework to support collective bargaining, but then also to support union activity, because only with strong unions you can have strong collective bargaining. The second example is from Ireland. There, the government was actually quite proactive. So at a very early stage, the government set up a high-level group with the explicit intention, if you read the report of this high-level group, the explicit intention was to be prepared for the directive, for whatever comes. So the high-level group actually published their report in autumn 2022. And there, once again, the biggest problem in Ireland is you have some kind of sectoral joint labor committees, they are called, where the objective is to set minimum standards for certain sectors where there are problematic working and wage conditions. And these, obviously, in these joint labor committees, employers and unions are supposed to interact. The problem really is in Ireland that the employers don't engage in these kind of structures, which are deemed to establish rules. So the recommendations, key recommendations of this high-level working group in Ireland are all about how can we get the employers to engage in bargaining processes, both at the sectoral level, but also at company level. And it's a mixture of creating incentives for the employer and creating soft pressure for employers. And I think at company level, for instance, they wrote it's a requirement for employers to engage in a process of good faith, which is basically what we know from France, an obligation to engage in bargaining if requested by the union to do so. It's the Irish just put it a little bit more polite, to engage in a process of good faith. But the problem really is this report was published at the end of 2022 and nothing happened since then. Partly also with the justification that they wanted to wait for the Commission report on the implementation of the directive and see whether that provides any insights in how to do that more effectively. But once again, our colleagues in Ireland are at it, and we can expect things get moving now. But these are the recommendations. And the third example, how the directive influences discussions about collective bargaining, is Germany. In the field of public procurement, because there is also an article on public procurement, a specification of existing regulation on public procurement. And there is a big debate in Germany about a federal public procurement law, which basically has the objective of ensuring that only companies that apply a collective agreement or are covered by a collective agreement get public money. And unfortunately, it was announced, it should have been the first draft should have been out in autumn last year, but due to the problematic situation in the government coalition at the moment, let's put it like that, this is on hold or still under discussion. Let's put it like that. But that would be a very progressive law, because a federal law at national level, we don't have in any other countries, where public procurement regulations are mainly at the municipal or regional level. So that would be, and once again, the discussion has been before about that in Germany, but it got a push through the directive. Yeah, perfect, because I'm at my last slide now. The actual impact of the directive. Well, I think what we saw is there is no one size fits all. I think we will always have national specific regulations and situations because of the tradition of the industrial relations systems and so on. So we need country specific solutions. And that's the directive allows for that. But then I think what's also important to recognize is the actual impact of the directive depends on an ambitious implementation. Because very often I had the impression that, in particular, from a trade union point of view, we celebrate this as a big victory. Hey, great, we have it. Social Europe exists. Wonderful. And now everything will change. No, it's not. The real implication of the directive will be decided with a national implementation. And that needs to be fought for at the national level as much as we had to fight for the adoption at European level. Because the same actors that wanted to water down the directive before it was adopted are now trying to water down the implementation. And that's why we need to be wary and need to be active. I know it's quite difficult after such a long fight to actually get it adopted. Now we have to keep fighting for the implementation, but it's very important because as we can see by the examples, the impact will actually depend on the national implementation. And finally, the advertising section of my presentation. Art already mentioned the policy brief that was just published, Dawn of a New Era, where I look at minimum wage developments 2024, and in a little bit more detail how the directive contributes to this. But equally interesting, I think, is a piece I wrote with Thorsten Schulten again, and that will be published in a book coming out in March about the collective bargaining aspect of it, the collective bargaining directive in disguise, and that will look at how the directive actually aims to strengthen collective bargaining. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Vielen Dank, Torsten. I was very much impressed by the way you pronounced voor een beter bestaan in Dutch. And indeed, quite amazing that a campaign, a nationwide campaign in the Netherlands refers to an EU social policy initiatives. I wonder what that means. So why is this a milestone for you, social policy making? I'm convinced. Let's see whether the audience is convinced. Let's especially see whether Ana Carla Pereira is convinced. Maybe I can already ask you to join us here on the stage. So Torsten, you explained that only Slovenia meets the double decency threshold for minimum wages. And so the directive may or is in fact already, as I see in your chapter, which was also a great joy to read and comment. It was a very swift process, so thank you for that to you and your co-author. So it is already putting pressure on member states to increase their ambitions, and at the same time, everything needs to be done at the national level. So let's not assume that it is already a win. Now we have Ana Carla on stage. So you know Ana Carla is an expert, the cabinet expert in Nicholas Schmidt's cabinet, former head of unit in DG Employment. That's where we had the pleasure of working together some time ago. And I know, of course, Ana Carla, that you can speak about any topic that has been discussed here today. So what I would like to ask you to do is first revisit what Torsten has just presented here, so Minimum Wage Directive. And I was wondering whether we could inverse the roles a little bit. Torsten was very positive about this directive from a trade union point of view. Maybe you can be more critical about what's happening with this, about the ambitions, about the actual implementation. It's just an invitation. Secondly, the EU's economic governance, as you heard, and I was so happy that you were here from the beginning, Ana Carla, which I find impressive in view of your agenda, and that you and your commissioner only have a few weeks or months left to realize your ambitions. So the EU's economic governance, self-sabotage from the EU member states. That was Esther Lynch's phrase this morning. And we retained from Sotiria Theodoropoulos' chapter in this book that she sees some progress compared to the previous set of rules on economic governance, but especially a big missed opportunity to rebalance economic and social ambitions in Europe. Your comments on that would be very welcome. Thirdly, platform work, as Esther explained this morning. Things keep on moving in surprising ways, sometimes on very short notice. Yesterday, the Greek government changed its position. Euroactive wrote, I think last week or 2 weeks ago, it's better to have no deal than a bad deal. Do we have a bad deal? I would like to have your opinion on that. And then housing and homelessness. Esther Lynch gave a personal testimony on that this morning. We have this chapter by Timo Weishaupt and Christian Hindrichs, which describes this new European platform on combating homelessness. It's quite optimistic about the platform, saying that it can really change some things in terms of learning. It's a bit like an open method of coordination, but knowing a few things about the open method of coordination, I wonder, is this really everything the EU can do about homelessness? A few questions for you, Ana Carla, and then we open it to the floor with some questions to you, and of course to Torsten with regard to this chapter. So please, Ana Carla.
So thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. And first of all, congratulations to Ose and the ATUI for another Bilan Social. It's always an accomplishment, I would say. But I will start with minimum wage and congratulate you for the work. I'm going to disappoint you, Bart. I'm not going to go against the positive vibes that have been shared here today. We do see the directive as an important landmark for its effect, but also what it means historically. Because if you look at how minimum wage, the conversation of minimum wage started in the world, it goes back a long, long way. And it has never been really put on the table at European level, except now. And so I think this is an important development in terms of what Europe can bring, even in areas where, if you read the treaty, you say, okay, there is it's a very narrow path. So if there is the political will, it is possible to explore that narrow path. Of course, when we have presented the directive, we were very well aware of what were those limitations, and Thorsten really explained them very well in terms of what is possible to put in a EU directive. But just to say that sometimes when we talk about employment and social policies, we say, it is not possible to legislate in certain areas, but you actually need to read the treaty properly. And for example, in social policy, you can legislate. The question is, do we have the alignment of stars, as some have mentioned here? Do we have the political willingness to make those things happen? And in relation to minimum wage, that was indeed an important moment of where different actors were engaged in this proposal. Of course, as you all know, this was one of the outcomes of the bargaining between the Commission and the Parliament when we were setting the political guidelines of the current Commission, and that, of course, is always a crucial moment in the mandate of the college mandates, and we are reaching that moment again. We can come back to that in a moment. I think that our assessment in relation to the impact of the Minimum Wage Directive concurs very much with what has been said. We see many countries looking at minimum wage, and in fact, despite the fact that real wages have decreased because of the cost of inflation, due to these measures that some of them have been announced, actually the real minimum wages actually have increased. So this is actually a good news and a very concrete impact of how the minimum wage has influenced, the directive has influenced policy making in the member states. I'm a little bit more skeptical on, on the immediate impact of the directive in relation to collective bargaining. I think there we still need to wait to see that impact. I think the political debate was much more alive when it comes to the statutory minimum wage. And in terms of collective bargaining, we really see that the countries are still searching. What does this mean for us? So I think this we need to see. In terms of transposition, most member states are telling us, because the colleagues in DG Employment have, of course, been working with the member states and asking, so what are your transposition plans? When are you going to send us those elements? And there are really no announcements made by the member states. So I guess we have to wait for October this year, because that's when we will have 2 years after the adoption of the directive to see what comes. So I think it's not exactly at the same pace when we talk about statutory minimum wages and collective bargaining. The other thing I need to say for the record is that when we talk about collective bargaining in the context of the directive, we talk about collective bargaining on wages, on wage setting. And I need to say this because we are being challenged, well, not us, but the co-legislator, I'm being challenged in court around this. I think it's important to clarify that what the directive asks is for member states who have collective bargaining below the 80%, that was explained, they establish action plans to promote collective bargaining in wage setting. Now, so it is important that also the analysis shows that, this is really related to wage setting.
Only refer to wage collective?
To collective bargaining, to collective coverage related to wage setting. Let's not forget that part of those sentences. But of course, I think what is also important is that in parallel, the Commission made a proposal on promoting social dialogue and collective bargaining in the member states, which is wider. It's not just about wage setting, and where we make a link with these action plans that are referred in the directive. And so I think this gives us a lot of space to continue to start, in fact, a dialogue with the member states on the promotion of collective bargaining. Now, I think that today there is a jumbo meeting between the EPSCO and the ECOFIN Council. And before that meeting, there has been a working breakfast between ministers on wage coordination in Europe. So I think this is, although a tangent to minimum wage, is also, I think, a signal that these conversations are less problematic at European level than before. And I think we should just welcome these steps. And certainly this has been very much put on the table at the initiative of the Belgian presidency, which we are very grateful for. So I don't know, I think for the moment I would stop here on minimum wage if you agree, Bart, but and move on to the next point you mentioned on the economic governance review. Well, I think that, right, this is either you see the glass half empty or half full, but it's definitely not full. So that's, I think, an important element. Yet, I think the new rules give member states space to consider a few issues, because of course they give the countries the possibility of creating paths towards investment, which was something that the ongoing rules don't give. So I think this is really an improvement, and within that there is a clear acknowledgement that in these paths and this space, there is an obligation also to support investment related to social policies and employment policies, which in the text of the regulation have been translated to the implementation of the European Pillar of Social Rights. And so this is extremely important because it means that it calls on member states when they are looking into their plans, and they will negotiate these plans with the Commission and then eventually have them approved in Council, that the social dimension needs to be part of the equation. Now, of course, I think then the big challenge will be how this conversation will be conducted and how these negotiations will be conducted. And in that respect, I think the fundamental piece is the role of the European semester and the role of the country-specific recommendations, because those will in many ways legitimize the space for spending. And so this gives an extra weight to the country-specific recommendations. If you follow the process of the Lisbon strategy, the European semester, you see that the country-specific recommendations moved from policy indications to an instrument to influence first the programming of cohesion funds, then became almost an imperative when the RRF came, and now they become an essential element on national spending. So I think this is really an important evolution, and obviously the weight that employment and social policies and recommendations might have in that context is fundamental to have that space of investment. So I think there is progress, but of course there is a need to have a lot of vigilance of how this now conversations with the member states are going to be conducted and how these national plans are going to be negotiated, in fact. Voila, that's, is it enough? There are many actors that will say, no, it is not enough. But looking at the constellation of the stars, I think this is actually a good deal, knowing how difficult it has been in Council and in many ways in the European Parliament. Now, the next point you mentioned was platform work. And of course, I am a very happy person today because yesterday we had this political agreement by the Council on the provisional agreement between co-legislators. And you ask me, do we have a bad deal? I say absolutely not. It's a good deal. It's a very good deal. Is it as good as the Commission proposal? In my mind, no, but it doesn't make it a bad deal per se. And there are, I mean, the directive, the compromise that has been reached between the presidency and the Parliament has 3 big chapters, in fact, but there are 2 that are really the ones that we discuss the most. The first one is around the idea of a presumption, of a legal presumption for employment, and I will come back to that. And the second one is about the use of algorithmic management in the workplace. And just because of this second element, it would already justify to say it's a good deal. Because this chapter on algorithmic management, what it does, it creates a blueprint on how we need to look at the use of algorithms in the workplace. For the moment, it is confined and limited to the use of algorithms by platforms. This has been a political choice to make sure that we were ready to embrace this in this space, and the fact that we have made a proposal that really has this strong element in it is because you don't have a platform if you don't have an algorithm. So it is so intrinsically linked that it was inevitable. And so this for us is really a very important piece and a very good deal for the future. And of course, it is a way of a sort of trailblazer on opens paths, first of all, for discussions that are happening in the international sphere. You have ILO, for example, now discussing on standards global wide, and this is really a very strong incentive for those conversations to be pursued. But it's also for us an incentive now to look at other parts of the labor market on how the algorithms and artificial intelligence in general is being used. So just for that, it is a good deal. On the presumption, and the reason why these are also linked things is that very often the algorithm conceals who is the employer. If you're in front of you, you only have an app. Who is behind the app, you don't know. So, and this has been a bit the gray zone that the actors in the platform economy have explored, have used in these years. So it was necessary to bring clarity and to bring rules that allow for a level playing field between these actors and other actors that do not necessarily use platforms to perform the same tasks. The presumption that is now included in the directive is basically, or the objective of this presumption is basically an objective of result. what the directive is now asking to the member states is to ensure that in each member state, in their national legislation, there is the figure of a presumption of employment. This exists in 3-4 member states. So there is a lot of work to be done by the other countries. And this presumption needs to be a facilitation for people who are currently bogus self-employed when they seek reclassification. So this is an important element. Now, our proposal, the Commission proposal, went a bit further in terms of an harmonization, because we proposed some elements that would be common to all mechanisms of presumption across the EU. This was not possible because the member states felt that in a way this was impinging on their definitions of workers. And therefore this was very difficult in Council to be achieved. But nonetheless, the fact that every member state needs to introduce a presumption is, in our view, a value added. It also obliges the shift of the burden of proof, because today, if a person believes that is wrongly classified and he wants to go to court, he needs to provide proof of that. The directive shifts the burden of proof to the platforms, and this in itself is already a very important thing. There are other provisions in the directive that now push for more transparency on the way platforms work, also in terms of cross-border cooperation. And this is very important because sometimes we tend to reduce this conversation on the Ubers and deliverers of this world and the riders and the people that we see on the streets. But in fact, the platform economy is much wider. And you have people that are sitting here and that are working for someone, I don't know, in Greece or Estonia, and it's absolutely unclear what's going on. And so there are also some provisions to bring clarity on this, which is in a way a new form of mobility, of work mobility in Europe. So voila, do we have a bad deal? I don't think so. And maybe the final point on homelessness and housing. So when Commissioner Schmidt took office, it was clear that there was an alignment of stars. Mainly in the parliament, to work on the issue of homelessness, which is an area where it's true, if you read the treaty, there it's really hard to find space to do something more binding. But yet, this is also to confirm what Esther Lynch said this morning, that not everything that is in the pillar leads to the same type of instruments. And when we discuss homelessness and we try to see what is possible, well, if we need to create a coalition of the willing, and this is what we can do, this is what we are going to do. And this is how this platform to combating homelessness has been created. And we are, I think, even surprised in a way by the positive effect this platform has brought in reinforcing the willingness of those who are working in this field to continue. So I think it boosted confidence and conviction on these things. On the fact that we have over time seen many member states putting more political attention to this issue. And so we have, I think 17 member states, I'm not wrong, who have announced or have already adopted a national strategy to combat homelessness. And of course, we have also a push to use better the EU instruments, and particularly the financial resources for this purpose. In many ways, and shared this with some colleagues. When we do a council recommendation, one of the immediate things we want to achieve is that member states also give it political attention and have their action plans. So it is quite remarkable that a platform, which is a sort of an open method of coordination, as you said, Bart, actually achieves that without having a text that went through council. So I think this is something that we should be happy about. But of course, it's not enough. And when we see the numbers of homeless people increasing in Europe, I mean, of course, it shows that the platform itself is not going to be the panacea for the issue. Now, I think the situation has also slightly evolved since the beginning of the mandate in terms of the economic context. And we see more and more the member states asking the Commission to be more forthcoming on housing issues. And this is where the alignment of stars seems to be starting to form on housing policies. It was not the case 5 years ago, but today with the inflation and well, the energy, first of all, the energy prices, which led many families not to be able to cope with their bills, led them to also not be able to cope with their mortgages and rents. But then came higher interest rates, which exacerbated the issue. And we have in many countries, particularly in capitals, this very significant phenomenon of short-term rentals, which basically are pushing away the rental market from long-term residents, because owners of houses feel that it's more profitable to have tourists coming for 3 days or 4. Like this, they have paid their costs of their apartments for the entire month. So that's easier in a way for the owner. But what it means is that it's pushing the rents higher, and pushing away the middle class and lower middle class from certain urban areas. And this is very, very acute in countries where there is a lot of tourism. So we are now confronted with this request from many places to look at housing as a European problem, and to look at our instruments to see whether they are fit for purpose. And one of the instruments is, for example, the state aid framework. Does it fit? Does it help? Does it limit action? And so these are some of the areas that we are looking for. This doesn't mean we will forget homelessness, but it's clearly that the picture is getting bigger, and it's not only of those that no longer have a house, but it's also those that can be at risk of not having a house anymore.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much, Ana Carla. So the stars may be aligning for more EU intervention, let's say, on homelessness. I noted a breakfast meeting on wage coordination in Europe, which would have been, I think, unthinkable 5 years ago. A glass half full for economic governance and platform work, a good deal. You were clear on that. Okay, let's see whether there are some questions from the room. And I know that we are all getting a little bit hungry now, so it's also time to wrap up at some point. But let's see if there are any questions from the room, both to Ana Carla and to Torsten, of course, with regard to minimum wage. Please, if you could briefly say who you are, we'll take 2-3 questions, and then we go for a wrap.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask about the Danish case challenging the adequate minimum wage directive, and if you think that will be successful.
Sorry, did you? Other questions? Yes, please, ma'am, and then Sabina.
Hi, I'm Letizia from the E2I, and I had a question to Thurston on the complementarity between the minimum wage and the collective bargaining. So thinking about the case of Italy, where there is no minimum statutory minimum wage, but there is a high collective bargaining, and the recent government is using the fact that there is an high collective bargaining for not implementing a statutory minimum wage. So how is this discussion about, and if it's true that it's not necessary?
Thank you. Slavina?
Yes. Thank you very much, first of all, Anna Carla, for these very interesting insights. My question is, could you, let's say, take out your crystal ball and tell us, according to you, what could be done further for improving social Europe during the next legislature? I know that it's a very difficult question, but still, I think that some speculations would be interesting for us. And then Thorsten, many thanks for your great presentation. I had prepared some conclusions on your chapter, but we won't have time to to talk about that. And so here I would like to ask you, in your chapter, you also mentioned some other very important initiatives in the field of collective bargaining and minimum wage. Could you please go back to them? I think it would be interesting for the audience. And then one of the questions I had prepared are based on a also great article by Henry Hapnala and colleagues from University of Antwerp on whether the minimum wage directive can get it right in terms of collective bargaining. And you came back to this question, Anna Caro, in your speech. And here, Thorsten, I would also like to build on this article and ask you, well, what could be done further at EU level to improve in-work poverty? You refer to that, and especially for part-time workers and single earner households. Then an issue that was also raised in the article by Henry is linked to employers who may also respond to higher minimum wages by reducing their demand for working hours, how this could be prevented. And finally, how the discrepancy between labor market insiders and outsiders should be also taken into account while implementing the directive. And then just a final thought. Anna Carla, you referred to the semester, and that's essential, I think. Thorsten, you gave the example of Bulgaria and of a good practice in Bulgaria, but we shouldn't forget that for years, Bulgaria has been receiving CSRs on the fact that the setting of the minimum wage was not transparent. And this means that there has been, thanks to the semester or work of preparation on indeed going towards this best practice, which was implemented thanks to the directive. So thank you.
Tommaso, very briefly, and then each of you get 2 minutes to respond to all the questions.
So I don't know then if then I should add more to the plate, but I just wanted to ask both of you about the end of the European Year of Skills, and in your opinion, what comes next, and how the skills shortage you think will be addressed in the upcoming years. Yeah, thank you.
Thorsten. You pick and choose.
I pick and choose. Danish case, I'll be very quick. I think that's the last desperate attempt to derail the directive. I think they won't stand any chance, because after all the legal services of the Council, of the Parliament, they came up with that this is in line with EU law, and I think the Commission was quite careful in putting it together. So I don't see any danger. I really think this is the last desperate attempt to try to get rid of it. Italy, another very interesting case, and Italy is another example where this directive actually also influences developments in countries that are not even concerned by the directive, because the parts on the minimum wage only apply to those countries with a statutory minimum wage. But in Italy, it was the case that actually it pushed the debate about a statutory minimum wage. And then we've just recently seen the opposition parties made a proposal to introduce a statutory minimum wage of €9. And the link is with collective bargaining is, of course, Italy has, at least according to all statistics, a coverage of 100%. But even if we discount some kind of statistical peculiarities, it is still above the 80%. So Italy would have, there's no need for an action plan in terms of collective bargaining. But the link with collective bargaining and minimum wages can be seen that many of those collective agreements actually include a minimum wage from which you cannot make a living. And in many sectors, the minimum wage regulated by the collective agreement is too low. And that was once again kind of a trigger for the unions, or at least two of the three main confederations, and the opposition political parties to restart the debate about a statutory minimum wage, saying, look, with our collective, we always say that with 100% coverage, we don't have a problem with low wages. Well, we actually do, because in some sectors, unions are not strong enough to impose a minimum wage or a wage from which a worker can make a living. And there we simply need a floor provided by a statutory minimum wage. Says I, coming from a country with a statutory minimum wage. Of course, my Nordic colleagues would strongly disagree with that. But that's where you see the link between collective bargaining and the minimum wage. The more far, I extended my 2 minutes already, huh?
You have one more.
Do I have one more?
1 more minute, yeah. You can choose.
Yeah, minimum wage directive and collective bargaining. Obviously, from a trade union point of view, I have to have a more optimistic view than you are, because I trust in the power of the unions to actually get proper action plans together at national level. And with these action plans and with the help of the monitoring of the Commission of these action plans, we will get to stronger sectoral bargaining. I'm more optimistic there.
Anna Carla?
All right, so crystal ball. Well, I think the big moment of negotiation will come when we will discuss the political guidelines of the next commission. That is the big moment, because this is my personal view, so I'm not speaking here on the views of the commissioner right now. I think after that, it's going to be very difficult to have new items, because the constellation of what we are foreseeing in the parliament after the elections is going to be a difficult one. But you can also foresee a very difficult constellation within the College of Commissioners, because if you see the votes in the member states right now and what are the values that the governments represent, obviously then when they appoint their new commissioners, that will also be reflected in the composition of the college. So I think this is going to be a more difficult mandate in the next mandate. So the crucial moment is the discussion of the next political guidelines. That is my personal take. Within that space, I think there is certainly scope to discuss artificial intelligence in the world of work. I think this is an area where there is sufficient awareness from the right to the left that this needs to be addressed. I think there is also quite some traction on issues related to mental health or psychosocial risks, as you want to label them. I do believe that there will be some political pressure on looking at just transitions. How far that will make it, I'm not certain, because as you are aware, in the political discussions now in the campaigns, there is a lot of resistance to take forward the Green Deal. So by default, that would affect also other things. But I think this is going to be part of the conversation. And I can also expect many forces in the European Parliament to put on the table democracy at work as one of the elements to be further discussed. I personally would love, so this is my own pitch, that we also have a strong gender equality agenda. And the next steps, in my view, are to look at things like health for women, because there is really a real big issue there. But also to look at the working conditions of some women, like domestic workers. But okay, that's my own personal pitch. I don't think this has reached the space, the political space in the debate to have some traction. On labor shortages, next week the Commission will adopt a communication on labor shortages, where we, in a way, take stock of what is the situation and put forward some elements. But fundamentally, this is an issue that needs to be dealt by social partners between employers and workers' organizations, because you cannot direct the market from Brussels. I mean, this is really about where demand and supply comes, and of course, what kind of policies can be put at national level. Having said that, we are giving it political visibility and space for the conversation to pursue. And so this is going to be adopted next week. And this is also one of the points of discussion for the tripartite social summit that is also taking place next week.
Thank you. Thank you, Anna-Carla. Thank you, Torsten, also Anna-Carla, for pitching gender equality as a potentially important field, and we're happy to support that also from the side of ETUI. Thank you so much to both of you. Now, we all deserve lunch, so it's time for a wrap. So what I would like to do now is to give both Slavina and a volunteer from the audience 4 minutes each to give us their wrap of the conference. I couldn't help noticing that Slavina recently appointed a new associate researcher at the European Social Observatory. He's in the back. It's Philippe Auchet, who also happens to be the former Director General of the European Trade Union Institute. So each of you have 4 minutes to guide us towards lunch. Maybe Torsten, if you wouldn't mind swapping with Philippe, if that's okay. And then I don't know who wants to start. Yeah, Philippe, maybe you want to get to take it on. Merci d'être là.
Yes, thank you. That's the first time that's a circle for me. After Observatoire ETUI, I returned to the Observatoire. It's very nice. So I will be try to have that in 3 minutes, because we merit to go for the lunch. And I was asked to put some idea about the macroeconomic chapter and the Green European Deal. And I think that's what we heard here. It's something rather interesting, because I never had in 24 years of the Bilan a so positive message about social Europe exists. And at the same time, it's the first chapter, and was the discussion from Esther at the very beginning. Where is the macroeconomic policy? Where is the monetary policy? And we had both at the ETUI and the OS the idea that social policy is social policy stricto sensu, but also economic policy. And there, I think that there is a big challenge, because we know we will have this kind of political compromise with all the social democrats. I think that's important, and some green in government, and then some kind of quasi agreement from all the economists that we need a huge investment. And then there will be, I think, for the future, there will be still room for discussion, and we will have the Draghi report, we will have URF and the MFF, etc. But what I suggest is perhaps to start a new way of thinking. Let's start by the investment are need, and then see how we can have them at European level. And I give just one example and finish on that. You have a fantastic paper on 23-24 sector, the deficit of investment if we want to reach the Green Deal. And for railways, investment are 1/3 of what is necessary. So all you want to have a kind of mobility if you don't change and to have train. So you start by the need, and then you put that at European level, not for each member state, but globally, because most are linking connection. So I think that perhaps start by the reality. The second, I think on the Green Deal and industrial policy is also interesting, because we speak a lot about should we have more social in the text, but if you look on the reality, and ETUI had a lot of study about the automotive transformation, it's a catastrophe. We produce the wrong car, which are sell to the rich people. So it's completely unjust and un-environmental friendly. So perhaps we have also to return to some kind of reality. It's exactly the same with the battery. The battery is low skill. It's not worker from the automotive industry will not go for the battery. It will be migrant worker. That's the case in Hungary. And in the waste and recycling, we know is the worst. There is no health and safety. There is risk. So let's speak a little bit more seriously about what are the consequences. And for the skill, where we will create a lot of job is construction, because we have retrofitting, we have the grid, we have all the connection that will be on construction. Let's speak about construction. That's a real stuff instead of speaking about skill and reskilling. And I finish, and I think that's really well present in the second paper, is do we speak about a transition or transformation? And I think we have to speak about the transformation. If we speak about the transformation, we enter in new territories. Let's enter for the next Bilan Social and other publication in new territories and done if that's we have a smooth transition, happy transition. Thank you.
Thank you. Happy transition from the European Social Observatory to the E2I, back to the OSE now here today. Philippe already referred to the next Bilan Social, so Slavinia, that gives you the final word.
Yeah, thank you very much, Bart and Philippe. And I first of all want to say that I'm happy to be here as a new director of the observatory on stage with my two previous directors, from whom I really learned a lot. And so going back to the conclusion, the question is, our main question was, do we see a paradigm shift at EU policymaking in the social area? And I think that today's intense and enriching discussion shows that this is indeed the case. And we political scientists like to use labels, and sometimes far-fetched labels, but labels are important. And going back to the Juncker Commission, the years and the work that was done under the Juncker Commission was labeled as political bricoleur. Political because indeed Juncker brought into European social policies the political paradigm of the pillar and renewed the idea of social Europe. And bricoleur because at the end of the day, the Juncker Commission revisited and revised existing acquis without really proposing really new legislation. And it's in continuity that the von der Leyen Commission, which proved highly ambitious, put several, as we saw, legislative initiatives on the table. And this period is again labeled by some political scientists as the Roaring 20s. We've been talking today a lot about alignment of stars, which is also a kind of a labeling, let's say. And it's true, it's absolutely true, but it also sounds a bit esoteric in the sphere of astrology, right? And joke apart, what we could really see is that there have been a real alignment and a lot of activism during this period of socially driven actors. And equally important, the two consecutive commissions displayed social acuity, listening and collaborating with these actors. This is what we call in political science the important entrepreneurship of the European Commission in the social area. And the key question, as already asked, is whether the next Commission could continue on this positive slope and what could be further done at EU level. And Tana Carla, you rightly pointed to the fact that the crucial moment will be the discussion of the next political guidelines. And here I think that there is a great window of opportunity for all these social actors and also for us who produce knowledge in this area to fight for more social and green Europe.
Thank you so much, Slavina. Also happy to see that the European Social Observatory is in such good hands now. You confirm that the paradigm shift is there. The next Bilan Social, which will be the 25th edition, will undoubtedly go further into that question. We discussed 3 of the chapters of that book today. There are others on economic governance, minimum income, homelessness, even though we, of course, start a debate on those. So I can imagine a second conference taking place in a few weeks from now. But today we did, I think, a very good job. We're all entitled to lunch now. Let me just thank Maria Nikolova, Sophie Cazier, and of course the people from the Compub department at T2I for making it happen and even producing a draft of this book. You'll have the very final version in your mailbox very soon. We stay in touch as always, and now we are entitled to lunch. Thank you very much.